Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku had a self-insert twin? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. When I wrote my first Naruto fanfic, a sweet one about reincarnation and trolling ninjas whilst safely tucked away in my patisserie, that wasn't an invitation, universe. Maybe I should explain a bit. I was 20-year-old history student at uni and had two much older sisters, who were also historians, and had already written books and been recognized as stupidly smart. You see the issue? Anything I did, they'd already done 5 years beforehand and probably to a better standard. We were all incredibly close and I was in no way angry or resentful, but it did get a bit draining being the baby. My response? Becoming a fanfic writer/reader. I'll grant you, it wasn't the most conventional way to strike out from being the same as my siblings, but it was a breath of fresh air. I'd never really written much, my old fics rather shitty and my new ones were only just starting to form. But I sure as F read a lot. I was still wading through my degree full steam ahead, but the fics were a nice way to let loose a bit. Nothing got rid of tension than some funny fandom memes on Tumblr. I'd started off with the basic mainstream ones like Naruto and Harry Potter, but the more I read, the more I stumbled across things like Full Metal Alchemist, Boku no Hero Academia, Hunter x Hunter and Bungo's Stray Dogs, just to mention a few favorites. My dive into rare pair hell was both glorious and inevitable. I accumulated quite the collection of favorite fics on FFN and bookmarks on AO3. And I always really enjoyed S/Is, to the point where, when I wrote my reincarnation FIC, it was on the back on the hundreds of SI/OC stories I'd read beforehand. And I'd seen a pattern where people seemed to feel they could easily, or not so easily, cut it in a different world. I, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. It was super awesome and badass to read about people kicking butt and takin names, but I had no illusions that I could do the same thing. When I'd started Yakanai, it was for the singular purpose of proving that decades of this life couldn't be so easily shaken in the next one. And because I loved how people were so happy when you wrote things. But anyway, just because you could wield chakra and do awesome ninja moves, didn't mean you could actually kill someone. Murder is murder, people. So anyway, I wrote this FIC. And then this happened. This is an emergency announcement. All passengers are to remain seated with their seatbelt fastened dash. My flight back from Stockholm was not great. Then there was a yell of brace, brace, and we tucked ourselves down like those laminated sheets told us to. The plane was dropping, I could frickin' feel it. It was like when you first took off, the strange weightlessness, like going over the edge of a roller coaster drop or that moment of flight on a trampoline, before gravity started yanking your butt back down again. This was considerably less okay than those examples. We were over the sea, a good few hours into the flight, and my best friend was crying loudly beside me. She was gripping my hand in her left and her phone in her right. I knew, without a doubt, she wished she had signal to call George. The baby, that was seated 2 rows in front and had mercifully slept up until now, was screaming so loudly. The lights were blinking and the pilot was yelling loudly over the din. I couldn't make out a word. That was when it all went very dark. It was a shock of metal, cold into my limbs, and then the crack on my head against Sophie's. The ringing in my ears was the last thing I knew. Well, up until I was aware that it was cozy warm again. Was this the hospital? It was dark, I couldn't really feel my face, so maybe my eyes were just closed, and warm, like a deliciously hot bath. I tried to take a breath, see if I could smell the disinfectant from the sheets or my dad's cologne or anything. One tiny issue? I couldn't take a breath. Freaking out inside, if I could breath, this would probably be my first panic attack. I made to pat myself down, only I couldn't really move either. Was I paralyzed or something? No, that wouldn't really account for the not breathing bit. Even in a coma you FING breathed. So what? A dream or? No, surely not. Something bumped into me, and if I could have turned to look, I would have popped something in my spine for how much it scared me. Feeling the way it was pressed against me, I could only assume it was someone else alongside me. Maybe we were being held together? I slowly lost consciousness again, my brain so sluggish and slow it honestly scared me. Then again, these days when wasn't I nervous? It must have been 2 weeks. No breathing, no food, very little movement beside my legs shifting, and yet still alive? That I heard them. Voices. Quickly, fate decided to F me over, when I noted they were in Japanese. Oh, for the fin love of dash. Now, I didn't speak Japanese. I wasn't bilingual in any sense of the word, unless swears and asking for directions to the toilet counted. All I knew was some stuff from fanfic and anime, like family names and nanny. I tried learning Old Norse for my degree before I decided to take a break, which I never came back from, hee. Remembering how I did this in my FIC, I swore revenge on the gods of irony. I was, evidently, a baby in the womb, reincarnated, whatever you wanted to call it. And, noting the fact that I wasn't in here alone, my best description was, fed. Being a fetus was next-level boring. I mean, obviously I hadn't expected it to be a wild ride in here, but, the next few months passed excruciatingly slowly. Now, I was a super lazy person, but even this was pushing me too far. I was warm and slept AF ton, and when I was awake, I kicked as much as I could. 1, to pass the time, and 2, because I was set off at this whole situation. Sorry, new mom, it's not your fault, but I'm doing it anyway. Well, I did kick, up until my twin was a little sheet and slowly shifted in front of me. What if and to kill joy, they better not be forming bad habits already. So, here we were. With so much time to kill, I'd thought long and hard about what I wanted to achieve here, casting my mind back to all the fics I'd read about coping with reincarnation. Maybe they weren't the best source for consultation, but, well, where else did people have highly rationalized discussions about rebirth coping mechanisms? Thankfully, after years of furiously working to keep up with my sister's brilliance and reading like a hurricane through the various fandoms, I had a pretty sound memory. I'd thought through everything furiously. I thought about the chances of this being a dream, a coma, anything but real. I thought about if I'd tell anyone, try and examine how this could have happened, if I'd be born anywhere I recognized. It only took me what felt like a few days to come to the conclusion to F it all. I was going to be okay. And you know why? Because I wasn't going to sabotage myself with things like existential crises or mental ages. I was going to live my life like a FING boss, and no one was going to try and convince me to tiptoe through. And this would be my life because there was no reason to torture myself thinking I'd somehow shoved myself into someone else's body, displaced their soul, or whatever. I was being reborn, simple as that, and I would, if I get a grip and deal. This would be my life and therefore my family. No comparisons and no strangers. My face would be different from my last one, naturally, but it wouldn't be a stranger's. It would still be me. Because I knew if I looked in the mirror, I'd see myself staring straight back out at me. These new parents and this twin beside me were going to be new, different. They wouldn't be ginger and have a beard like my other dad. They wouldn't be super tall and strong like my other mum, or have freckles everywhere like both I and my sisters had had. They'd be their own people and I'd hopefully grow to love them. If they were horrible and bad, well then. I'd already had a great family before. Those memories would have to see me through, and I'd just simply say refuge to these ones. I wasn't going to be some sissy and have a mental and emotional breakdown over something I couldn't control. I'd been famously good back home at rolling with the punches and being a rational person. I'd be dead if I let a hurdle like this screw me over. Coming to terms with what I lost was the first step. It would be harder, and even more real, if I waited until I was in the outside world again. So, I'd cried a lot, as much as I could in the womb, and thought about my parents. I felt such a deep regret when I thought of Sophie. She'd been older than me, taking a few years out before uni, and George had had another year on us both. They were going to move in with each other in the summer, right after Amira's birthday. Yes, they did hold a party for their fat, ginger cat. I thought about the Japanese I'd heard and mourned my own language and culture. But then, I made myself think about kimonos and Tokyo and felt a bit better. I'd always wanted to go there, and my cousin had promised to take me out for Pocky if I visited him and his boyfriend, but I'd never gotten round to it. I'd lost so much, everything, but I'd be gaining some things as well. A new life, A new family. Even if the one I would be joining was a terrible one, I'd hopefully still have the tiny baby beside me out there too. As the months passed and I gradually came to terms that this was really happening, things started to get a little bit cramped. My mind helpfully reminded me of all the effed up things a damaged umbilical cord could do, horror stories provided by Mum and Grammy, as my own and my twins were pressed against us, squashed as we were. And then one day the warm water started moving. As the daughter and granddaughter of midwives, I'd been a massive idiot and forgotten the most important part of PRDZY. The birthing bit. It was loud and messy and reminded me way too much of the plane. Whilst I'd read and written about the horror of being born, I had the double issue of a twin. Which meant triple the stress. Stress for me, for them, and then also for the both of us. I'd never freaked out so much in my life, in both of them. It was exhausting and terrifying, and so, when I felt the black creep along the edges of my vision, I bade a strategic retreat from the situation and passed out. I came to with a slap and a scream. Sheet, Dfang nope. Wiped down with a cloth that felt like it was sandpaper on my tender skin, I barely even noticed how weird it felt to breathe air again. I was, naturally, too busy making sure everyone knew how unhappy I was by screaming like a demon. Wrapped in swaddling and carried around just added to the flames of my malcontent. Trust exercises were hard enough when you were physically able, being lifted around by giants when you couldn't move yourself and were the size of a loaf of bread? I was wailing for a cradle or something, just put me the F down. When I was tucked into someone's I felt melons, probably Mum. I swore that, if I ever had to go through that again, I'd have a heart attack. Mental note, ever help out with a BRH in the future? I was going to be as secure and comforting to that newborn as possible. No FANG two-handed lifts going on here. I'm talking both arms and against the hixie. Cracking open my eyes was a chore and a half. They felt swollen and wrinkly like I was E.T. or something, but I really wanted to make sure I wasn't born into some crazy planet. Mum was blurry, like when I'd made the mistake to try and swim without goggles, and the blue blob opposite me was probably my twin. Judging by hospital gender stereotypes with blanket colors, I came to the conclusion I had a bro cool. That's another new experience to add to the books. Mum looked nice, surprisingly young with flawless, if sweaty, pale skin and spiky ash blonde hair. Paired with her scarlet eyes, I mused that she must be albino or something. The brown blob I identified as Dad leaning over her shoulder was an average-looking man with warm coffee hair and eyes and with specs perched on his nose. In all honesty, he looked a bit green but very emotionally happy. Well, so far so good, I'd say. My new mum whispered to me, and even though I missed half of what she said, 3 things stuck out. I absently wondered if I could go back into the womb now please, where I was safe, warm, and ignorant. Kagami, my new name I guessed. Katsuki, my brother? Bakugous, sheet. So much for Mum just being an albino. I slept an awful lot the next few months. It was marginally better than being in the womb, at least I could move and breathe and hear etc. Unfortunately, there were also some cons. Like, I don't know, being able to hear Katsuki scream and scream and scream? Now, I was firmly in the fandom boat of Ye little sheet piece Hidi Sansobekov, and I knew that he'd done some terrible things and would grow up to be a supremely complicated person. This didn't change the fact that I adore the little devil, and also, he cried so much, sometimes I'd start screaming too just to let out the frustration. He was a handful and that would never change, it was just the way he was. Whilst I knew that there was a chance he'd make a show of disregarding me, like he'd done with his parents, I knew I wouldn't let him. He might have made a point about not needing anyone, but he'd still loved his parents and accumulated a group of kickbutt friends as a Baku squad. Like, seriously dude? Goals, right there? And my response to all this sheet? Like was I gonna be left behind? Katsuki, whilst a thorn in my side with his screaming, was my twin and we were all but glued to each other. We shared a crib as was recommended with twins, and I woke up from my naps to his small face. Whilst screaming was an excellent way to vent my emotions, used as a coping mechanism in some ways, get attention from Ka-san and Tu-san or just harmonize with my bro, I was in actual fact a very happy baby. Well, in comparison to some demons, like my brother. Despite only being 6 months old, Katsuki was a hellion. He threw his food, grinned like he'd successfully summoned Satan, and didn't like words like no. In comparison, I was rather sweet. With my memories of running and walking etc., I was able to start crawling from a reasonably young age. Without the worry of looking like a child genius and then hurried through the system to be an assassin, Naruto cough, I let loose a bit. Katsuki made a mess? I made sure I was firmly as innocent as possible by moving the effed away. The babyish betrayal on my twin's face when he started to understand how I was never getting into trouble, even when I helped, was adorable, and I savored it. It was nice to know that he didn't underestimate me. Now, you would have thought I'd use my brains to get my brother out of trouble. Nope. Katsu, in the anime, would grow up arrogant and self-important, from a lifetime of not being in trouble and excused. Because of the power of his quirk, he could deal with some scolding and control in my eyes. Also, making him acknowledge me as an equal in strength was an absolute must. And anyway, if he was left to run amok, then there was no way he'd grow. I'd loved who he was in the anime, but I wasn't going to let him grow up so isolated. His mindset had been different from most, basing people on strength etc., and I wasn't sure that was just from his treatment as a child. Nevertheless, I wasn't going to let him get away with misbehaving. I needed him to understand what he couldn't just do as he wanted as much as I needed to exert myself as not another of his stepping stones from a ridiculously young age. I didn't think he needed fixing as much as he needed to know I understood how he saw and was making sure I fit into his world the way I wanted to. When we were older, I'd have to be much better about it. He was my brother and I loved him. As a baby though, he'd probably never remember this and he'd never really understand what was happening anyway. But babies were super susceptible to guidance etc. at this age, so hopefully, I was making a social and mental impact. So, aside from looking like a normal kid to my parents and a genius to my brother, life was really normal. Well, if you ignored the hero fights that were always broadcast on the news. It was so strange living a manga/anime as real life. Things weren't like the animation, they were FING real, and seeing All Might in real life? IFNG choked. How the hell were his eyes still shaded like that? Not to mention how huge he was? And the villain behind him? I'd never laugh at Men in Black again. Well, if I ever got to watch it again. The villain, guy? The girl? I don't know, had purple spikes, like crystal, growing out of his spine like some alien porcupine. I was just getting into the fight when Mum let out a curse and turned over. He was just pulling one out of his shoulder, probably to use as a sword. I got that. For babies, it wasn't exactly U-rated, but geez. It was just getting good. Mum, for all her swears, was a responsible parent. So was Dad, although he had bonus points for doing most of the cooking and not having a potty mouth. Boo for me that, despite making me bored by turning off fights, Mum and Dad were really nice. They talked a lot to us and laughed loads as well. I mean, I didn't really understand what was being said, but I guess it was the thought that counted. Even if it just made me super aware of the hell that would await me when it came to learning the language properly. Both of our parents were fashion designers, from what I could tell. I didn't think Mitsuki's job had ever been mentioned in the anime or manga, but, from the amount of help she provided Dad, I could only guess they must work together in some way. Or maybe she was like me and just liked clothes. They were both stay-at-home workers, except when Dad occasionally met with his team to hash out the latest designs, and everything was very domestic. Mum left to go food shopping a few times a week, and we'd had a nice babysitter what us a few times when they went out for tea. The babysitter, a nice lady from across the street called Suki, could make colored bubbles from her skin. They all smelled different when popped, pink for strawberry, green for grass, etc., and I thought she was lovely. I'd pop as many pink as possible. She quickly twigged on and started making just those ones for me, so I'd reek of strawberries for days after. Katsu wasn't all that impressed with her, but I liked her. She'd put on the T.V when it was our bedtime, and that was the majority of outside interaction we really got. I was relieved for the reprise, knowing the drama that would await us in a few years, and, in celebration for a normal babyhood, made a point of getting Katsu into the habit of letting me hold his hand, so much so that he started holding his hand out when I was next to him. Score. Sadly, my days of laziness would face a new challenge: walking. I'd been trying to for ages, hating not being able to control where it was I was going, but I'd wanted to know just for my sake. I still wanted to be carried everywhere like a queen, thank you very much. And that's where I hit a roadblock. When we were almost a year old, Mum caught me trying to stand. It had been an honest accident. I mean, I'd been crawling for months, but now the cat was out of the bag. And then Katsuki, not to be outdone, the little sheet, immediately tried to join me where I was holding onto the coffee table legs. The sight of the two of us, holding onto the table legs for dear life in our matching baby grows and scowls, was evidently too much, and cousin barked out a laugh before calling for Tusan. The encouragement to walk was heavy from that point on, and 2 weeks later, Katsu just about managed it. In true fashion, he did it walking away, rather than to our waiting parents. That he was walking towards me was, besides the point. Shown up by a baby, I resisted the urge to throw my biscuit at his head. My self-pride reared up, and I found myself awkwardly stomping to meet my twin halfway instead. It felt like that bit in WALL-E, when the captain walks again, in all honesty. A camera shutter had us blinking in union at Masaru, holding hands for structural support, and forever immortalized in our onesies and matching spiky hair. Did I mention that we were identical? Well, at least I knew there was an extremely good chance I'd grow up smoking hot, in more than just one way, hee. By the time we were almost 2, Katsuki had started speaking in earnest, and I was awkwardly trailing along behind. It wasn't my fault, okay? I'd always struggled with languages, and this one was even harder. Nothing was similar to English, not the spelling and not the structure, at least I'd had that with French. So yeah, I was stuck being the smart but quiet one whilst Katsu did all the speaking. And that boy, I swear Deepening, not the best for charming points. Even as a toddler, my brother was brash and arrogant. Sure, it was just the self-assurance and loudness of kids, but when stood next to me, I looked like the typical manga girl. You know, the shy and intellectual type who blushes and gasps at the slightest bit of attention or human contact. R.I.P. my kickassery. So, to compensate for this, I made a point to learn as much as I could about the language. Downside? It was boring as F, and I wanted to kill a beach, preferably the one who sent me here. But the upside? When Katsuki was told off for imitating Mum and saying F- the first time, I silenced the room by saying sheet. We were both sent to our room with no dessert, but seeing the impressed smile on Katsu's face? Ooh, so frickin' worth it. After my little show, our parents did a little reassessment of me from what I could tell. The next time we went out to play, Katsu was still looking smug and I indulged him. He'd never, thankfully, treated me as or seen me like a dead weight. I mean, sure, I was the older one by 3 minutes, but Katsu was louder, not really by choice, I know, and it would have been easy for anyone to be overshadowed. Katsu, however, knew better. He'd never, ever been without me, and I knew he could see my smarts behind my eyes. I might not be able to say all that much, but the boy knew I wasn't a pushabout either. I'd never once stood down or back from him, never walked behind him, and never so much as blinked at his tantrums. The swearing had just been proof to him that he was right. About me all along. Who knew swearing was the way to Katsu's heart? Remembering an awesome Kachako comic on Tumblr, I let out a little giggle. So, maybe I wasn't the first then. When we were almost 3, I spotted a woman with green hair in the park. Even in a world of quirks, I'd recognize that head anywhere, and knowing the plot, I knew it must be her. Inko. I couldn't believe it, Izuku was here. I knew he'd known Katsu since before their quirks, or lack thereof, emerged, but hot damn, this was young. D&G hell, I wasn't emotionally ready for this. Warning, major plotline ahead. I internally screamed. This was very different to my reactions to Katsuki and our parents. I'd had months in the womb to get used to the idea of a twin and new family. That family just happened to be the Bakugous was a shock to the system, and that my twin was Katsuki? My hot-headed baby? I'd been beyond surprised. But then I'd had years as a baby to grow with them, and they were mine now, just as much as my last family had been. Izuku was just Izuku. He was the central character of the whole storyline, the quirkless boy who got a quirk and had to deal with the legacy, basically. He was such a bundle of emotions and everything that I wasn't sure if I was going to cry, try and smother him in love, or just run for the hills. I glanced around and, noting that my twin was waiting for me to follow him to the climbing frame, I set off after him, mind still whirling. And that was another can of worms. Kakin and Deku, dare I interfere? I knew myself well enough that, at the first sign of bullying or anything, I'd be in there like a shot. Thinking back to the day Izuku was revealed as quirkless, I knew I'd be stood in between him and the others in a heartbeat. I could only pray that Katsu wouldn't hate me for it. Climbing frames were Katsu's favorite bit in the playground. Whilst I loved the sandpit, I loved just squishing the wet sand, so satisfying. Katsu liked to move and climb and race to the top. I just didn't really like air heights. I'd been a bit nervous around them before, not liking super high bridges or those fancy glass elevators. And then with the drop of the plane, well, I wouldn't be flying for a while. But then, Katsu would smirk down at me like he was winning some kind of competition from wherever he'd gotten to, and I'd feel the intense need to drop kick him down to second place. And then, before I knew it, my hands were reaching up to grip the ropes and I was lugging my little body after him. We must have looked adorable, two identical grinning blondes, Katsu in tan shorts and a red tee whilst I wore the same t-shirt under my tan dungarees, hanging off each other like monkeys. The ropes burned my hands as I slowly scaled the spider frame, SWs wobbly on the longer ropes and slowly shuffling round the kids in my way. I was halfway up to Katsuki, maybe a meter off the sandy ground, when a yelp sounded behind me. Someone slipped on the rope and bumped into my back with a soft oof, and I grasped desperately at the frame, staring down at the sand below as I swayed. Sorry. A voice quivered behind me, little hands tugging on my top to pull me back upright. It's Phi Dash, I sighed, turning around to freeze at Emerald Curls. I blinked a few times, taking in how his eyes watery slightly with nerves. I'm Kagami, I grinned, trying to look as approachable as possible, and that's my twin Katsuki up there. I pointed at where my brother was holding onto the highest pole like King Kong, grinning like a psycho. What a cutie. DQ. He smiled back, shy and still a little guilty. I leaned over and tugged on his hand, pulling him along as I carefully shuffled around the next pole. Shall we try and catch up to Katsu? I encouraged, already leaning up the grip the next rope. The other boy nodded vigorously, gripping my hand in genuine excitement. His small fingers were clammy but I held onto them tightly anyway. Izuku was proving to be just as much a sweetheart as in the anime. It took us quite a while, slow and careful and faithfully waiting for each other at each new band. But eventually we caught up to my brother, who was viciously defending his post at the highest spot from some other boys. Katsu! I called and his eyes immediately latched onto mine. Glancing to my new friend, I noticed how my twin's eyes tracked to where I clasped hands with Izuku. This is my new friend, Izuku, and the green-haired boy flushed crimson in embarrassment. Neither boy said anything and I rolled my eyes at these two dorks. With a put-upon sigh when Katsu spontaneously started talking about how he was king on the climbing frame, I settled in to watch as the other boys, the ones trying to get him to move earlier, listened with rapt attention. A glance out the side of my eye showed how Izuku was beaming in delight at Katsu's enthusiasm, and then another game was suggested on the way down, something to do with tag and safe zones. When we all started, slowly on my part, descending, I immediately backseat beinged. Most people had a thing about not being it, feeling left out as everyone ran away from them. I'd been like too, as a kid, almost panicking as I ran desperately after my friends as they laughed and had fun. Now, it was the most perfect opportunity to wreak all the havoc I wanted. Tag! I crowed happily, slapping Katsu between the shoulder blades for the 5th time, before booking it to the nearest tree, snickering at his growl of fury. Hearing breathing behind me, I flicked a glance over my shoulder to see Izuku's grin as he followed along behind. Here, quick! I breathed, grasping his equally clammy hand in mine and pulling us both to squat on the other side of the trunk. Shoo! I giggled, buzzing from the excitement of riling my twin up. We giggled happily anyway. All I could think was that Katsu was so funny too when he got frustrated and Izuku had the most adorably infectious grin. He was nervous but such a happy child, and the lack of nerves or fear made me almost deliriously happy. Izuku! A warm female voice called, making the boy beside me jerk in surprise. We turned in union to see an equally emerald-haired woman walking up behind us. She smiled when she caught sight of us, her large eyes twinkling in the sunlight that filtered through the leaves. "Hello, and who's this?" she asked, looking between the two of us as we straightened up. "Bakugous Kagami hi." I grinned, bowing politely before bopping back upright to bounce on my toes. "I loved Inko." Emerald eyes widened in surprise. "Bakugous?" Unfortunately, the moment was shattered by the arrival of a katsu-shaped meteor. "Gore, Kagami dash." He growled in my ear as he threw himself at me, and I went down like a sack of potatoes with a yelp. Inko and Izuku were both panicking above us as we rolled on the grass, and I mentally waved our peaceful meeting goodbye. Now, Katsuki and I weren't trying to kill each other. Despite Katsu's energetic disposition and my propensity to troll him, we were firmly in each other's back pockets. So, as we rolled around, we were just having a bit of fun. Of course, to the Midoriyas, we looked like two wolf cubs attempting cannibalism. "Oi brats!" Kasan's voice called to us from across the playground, and I immediately jerked to look as our mother marched over. Catching sight of the green-haired duo, Mitsuki's stride stuttered in surprise when she undoubtedly recognized Inko. The rest was, as you say, history. After explaining that she did not, in fact, raise us like animals, Mitsuki and Inko ended up talking for ages. I knew they knew each other, that my parents and Inko had been old friends, but I was starving, damn it. When I started whining I was a kid, I'd bloody well use the excuse to be a brat as much as I wanted. Leaning heavily on Katsu as we lay on the grass nearby, I mentally counted down how long it would take before Katsuki got so annoyed and demanded money for snacks. "Fine," he growled, 5 minutes later, and I grinned evilly. "Bingo! Kaga's starved, old hag." My brother rolled his eyes, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I sat up and stuffed my fist in my mouth to muffle my sniggers at Mum's expression. He'd never called her that before. "What?" Mitsuki squawked, one distracted hand coming up to feel the impossible smoothness of her face, ignoring the fact her quirk meant she looked permanently airbrushed. "Kasan." I decided I'd been evil enough for one day and started in on the damage control. "We're hungry, can we have a lunch?" I blinked cutely, but, seeing as I was one half of the terrible Bakugous twins, the effect wasn't all that compelling. "Please?" "But I know. Some god out there is sitting laughing at my lisp. But I was just going to move past it. And anyway, it was pretty selective, a side effect of my spotty knowledge of Japanese instead of an actual speak impediment. I'm sure it would just sort itself out. ****. Izuku, what a cutie, chipped in at that point, blurting out in that rambling way of his that he hadn't eaten either and perhaps we could go get food together, and, needless to say, we got some ice cream from a nearby vendor. After that first meeting with Izuku, Inko and Kasan seemed determined to reconnect their friendship. This, naturally, meant that the three of us kids were really thrown together. I still hadn't worked out if they thought we all liked each other that much or if they just wanted chill-out time for themselves. Knowing Inko's character, I was inclined to go with option 1 and give my own folks the benefit of the doubt. Despite my presence, Katsuki and Izuku still developed a strange dynamic. Where the shy boy seemed to find my brother brave and heroic, Katsu basked in the attention given to him. I'd always treated Katsuki like my equal, and now that Izuku was looking up to him, Katsu was getting a bit smug, a lot. They spent hours play-acting as All Might, running around like lunatics. If we were outside, like at the park or wherever, I'd join in. But, if we were at home, I'd beg and plead for Mum to turn on the news so I could watch the latest fights. Watch the real-life fights was 1,000 times more exciting than pretending any day in my books. Kasan was still annoyingly responsible, turning over if things got too violent or she felt I was being antisocial. I was just learning about Quirk culture? Izuku and I got on pretty well though, even if I think my being a girl made him a bit nervous and he admired Katsu so much. I was definitely the calm one when I could be bothered between the three of us. Izuku was extremely excitable, bouncing around like he was on a permanent sugar rush. Katsu, on the other hand, could get a bit rough. I could deal, having done my fair share of sports and roughhousing with cousins before, but I was conscious of how sweet Izuku was. Not that he was a wimp or anything, but he was as quick to both laughter and tears as Katsuki was to anger. When Izuku started calling him Kakin, I grinned at my brother's annoyed face like the cat that got the cream. My expression seemed to say, "Look who's got a best friend, Mr. Superior." And that was what happened up until we started nursery, playdates most days. Inko didn't work, as far as I could tell, and I'd yet to meet or hear of Hisashi, so we spent a lot of time together. When we started nursery the following April, I felt the anticipation increase. And it wasn't just because Katsu and I were starting or that we'd the oldest in class. Katsu and I were turning 4 on the 20th. Now, I knew that quirks could take a while to develop and that the chances I had a quirk were extremely high. I mean, Katsuki and I were genetically identical. Not only were our toes the same, but the chances that we could even have the same quirk were high too. But I couldn't help and think about any unpredictable side effects of reincarnation, besides the obvious memory thing. I mean, I'd lived my entire life last time with no special abilities, in a world that had no special abilities. What if, somehow, that made me quirkless or something? Now, I had zero issues whatsoever with being quirkless. I'd lived my previous life technically quirkless, so I wasn't exactly missing something. I knew it would be completely different here. The stigma was something extremely difficult to handle, and it was different, being left out, than where everyone was gifted. And I wanted to be a hero. If I had a quirk, not only was there no way in hell I was letting Katsuki follow the plot without me, at the very least, I needed to be there, but I didn't want anyone else to have their lives cut off so quickly as mine had been. I wanted people to live a long, fulfilling life, as corny as it kind of sounded. And if I was quirkless? Of course, I would 300% need to stick a massive 2 fingers up at the system. That wasn't really what I was worried about. Sure, it would be extremely hard, but, well, I'd already died. Any other bullshit could go screw itself. I was more concerned about Katsuki. I'd gone to great lengths to ensure that my brother had fit his worldview to include me as an equal. And if I was quirkless, I just didn't know what I'd do. Would he react like he had to Izuku? Would he try and protect me, thinking me weak and unable to protect myself? The idea that he could reject me was deeply terrifying. Since realizing what was happening in the womb, I'd planned everything around including my twin in my life. If Katsu reacted badly and tore that grounding rock away from me, I wasn't sure how I'd cope. I didn't know, and I didn't like that I didn't know at all. Kasen called for me. "Are you ready to go yet?" Fiddling with the hem of my dress, I yelled back that I'd be down in a minute, tugging my ponytail straight. Living in an anime was so weird. Nothing was animated, it was like real life in every way because it was real life. And Katsuki's hair was impossibly spiky, yes. Thankfully, my hair was considerably longer, and when I attacked it each morning with a hairbrush, I could get it back into a ponytail with a sleekness that could rival the work of best genist. Unfortunately, because it was still quite short, my hair was like a spiky albino pineapple at the back, but, well, kudos to me for trying. For nursery, I had to wear the stupid uniform. Thankfully, the baby blue pinafore dress made my ash hair and scarlet eyes pop, and I was quite satisfied with the effect. Hey, just because I died and was a brat now, didn't mean I'd lost my sense of style. Then again, because kids were monsters and my twin was the worst of the lot, I also had to wear a pair of short navy shorts underneath. This girl be flashing no one. Satisfied that I looked nicely put together, I ran down the stairs, using the end of the banister to swing round the corner and propel myself into the kitchen. Katsuki was wolfing down something that had obviously been breakfast at some point, before he'd destroyed it with chili sauce and the chili flakes that Tu-san had learned to put next to his plate. Morning, Tu-san looked up from his rice to smile at me, already shuffling some designs next to him on the table. I grinned ruefully back, internally sighing over the hell that awaited me. As the youngest child before by a lot, and the youngest of my cousins, too, I wasn't really used to kids. Obviously, Katsu and Izuku were different because they were characters I'd already loved, and so, Tolerating their youthfulness wasn't so much a trial as it was a source of amusement. But other random brats? Someone save me. It wasn't just that, language issues aside, I was so much smarter than the rest. I was also so much more emotionally developed. Well, I was mentally matured enough to be able to reason with this body's traitorous responses, like emotions and hormones, not just yet, but one day, so it felt like I was more emotionally mature. I wasn't an adult stuck in a baby's body, after all. Except for my memories, mature outlook and personality, I was living life like the toddler I was. Ergo, when I hit PBR2I, I wouldn't feel like a creep/cradle robber. Yay for me. Now, the chances of me dying alone unless I got a sugar daddy were considerably lower. I plunked myself down next to my brother, idly crinkling my nose at the sheet he was eating. God, I couldn't wait for the day he became a fantastic cook, and pulled my fruit towards me. I'd lived in Europe in my previous life and I just couldn't get my head around the traditional Japanese breakfast fare. This was the 21st century, obviously I could have had cereal, but my folks seemed to like the whole, rice etc. family breakfasts and Katsu certainly couldn't pour chili on his cereal. Wait, or could he? On second thoughts, I didn't need those mental images. When we'd all eaten, our folks walked us to school. The nursery was a 10-minute walk, cutting across the nearby park. Izuku was going to go to the same place as us, living only around the corner from our house in a nearby apartment block. The school was a reasonably small one for one in the city, from what I'd eavesdropped from our parents, and had an older school annexed onto it. But I'd probably end up going to the same school for the next decade. The place itself looked alright, like any other generic school I'd seen. You know the look, large building, courtyard and grassy playing field. There were loads of brats and their parents milling about the place, undoubtedly saying a last bye to their families before we were called to line up to go in. As soon as we arrived, Masaru spotted the Midoriyas and tugged the rest of us along behind him, his broader frame easily maneuvering through the small crowd of parents. Inko. Two-Sen smiled, never more at ease than when he was at home or talking to his childhood friend. I guess that was the effect those close to you could have on usually nervous dispositions. The other woman smiled brightly in greeting, taking a moment to wish my brother and I a good day before Kasan-edi her into conversation. Izuku was bouncing around like he had springs on his soles and, whilst Katsu rolled his eyes, I merely grinned at his excitement. We'd barely been there for 5 minutes when a loud whistle sounded and our parents were sending us off with expectant expressions and final words. Well, Izuku got have fun, I got play nice, and Katsu, naturally, got behave dash. Taking the lead, my brother marched onwards, like a king into his castle, with Izuku trailing half a step behind him. The only reason I didn't fall behind was because of the hand that Katsu reflexively allowed me to grab. Good to see my training wasn't wearing off anytime soon. Our classroom was buttercup yellow and filled with adorable little baby desks. The teacher, a tall brunette man in his late 30s called Yasano-sensei, was perpetually cheerful and had a wonderful attitude for teaching children as far as I could see. It really set me off. Ignoring reading, writing, and recent history, where, as far as I could tell, the two worlds were completely the same up until the first quirks emerged 50 or so years ago, I already knew all this bullshit. Predictably, school wasn't great for me. And just to top everything off, 2 days later, Katsuki got in a fight. Some older brats bumped into him and bam. Katsuki, seeing it as them all but begging for a fight, proceeded to try and bash the living daylights out of boys almost twice his size. Grr. What was I going to do with that boy? Even worse was the fact that he won. Now, if Katsu got hurt or looked like he was going to lose, I'd have been in there like a bullet from a gun and just as damaging. But the fact that he won only made him insufferably smug, and the nearby group of boys, ones we occasionally saw around and were in our class, now thought Katsuki was the best thing since sliced bread. This group included Izuku. Do you see where this is going? I'd like to think that my presence had done my brother some serious good. He was less self-absorbed and seemed to be much more tolerant than the anime/manga had led us to believe. Despite his rough outsides, he was a bit of a softie when it came to me, and I was honest enough with myself to admit I was a sucker for him as well. Maybe it was just wishful thinking. Maybe I had changed some things. But I wasn't confident, couldn't be confident, until I saw if I could stop events in their tracks. And that was my cue. Just a Deku dash. I think Deku suits him better, Katsu. The group froze, the trio of boys who stood behind my brother, and Izuku who stood in front of him, stopping Katsuki from beating on a body who'd stopped fighting back. It was Katsuki I was watching though. The blonde boy had frozen completely, and even though I could only really watch the tension of his shoulders, I could easily imagine the look on his face. We all stood, strangely suspended, for a moment or two before I made my way closer and Katsuki turned to glance at me over his shoulder. "What's it to you, eh?" I shot him a narrow-eyed look, letting him know how unimpressed I was, as I stretched out my hand for Izuku's. When he slowly took mine, looking like he didn't really understand the silent exchange between us twins, I was unhappy to note how cold and sweaty he felt. That was fear and dread, not excitement. The other boys mumbled behind me about how it was just a joke and why was I overreacting, and I was pretty sure one of them mumbled to Katsuki to do something about your sister. I'd like to see any of them even try. I didn't even blink, having no patience for little brats who followed the strongest leader. I didn't give people who fought like a pack of wolves, many against one, the time of day. Call it leftover etiquette from my fencing and karate, but I hated dishonorable fights. The reason behind those particular sports was that my dad had insisted that we all learn self-defense, ergo, karate, and my eldest sister took up fencing at uni when I was just 7 and so, desperate to be just like her, I took it up as well. I ended up starting both from a very young age. This body might lack the strength or muscle memory, but I knew what to do with my body, even if it didn't automatically remember. I was in a particularly unforgiving mood and Katsuki seemed to notice, staring at me hard before he rolled his eyes and moved away, acting like he didn't give a shit. He played it cool as he walked away with those boys trailing after him, waving it off, and I pretended for my own peace of mind that I hadn't just challenged my brother in a power play. There would be repercussions to this, I was sure. But looking at Izuku's hopeful and genuine smile as I led him away from the other boys, I couldn't regret interfering in the slightest. A week before our 4th birthday, Katsuki got his quirk. And he got it fighting with me. And then I got my quirk. And then our sofa caught fire. Maybe I should explain a bit more. We were talking about heroes. Katsu slumped beside me on the sofa as I was absorbed in the latest fight on TV, when Katsuki announced that he was going to be a hero, number 1, to be exact. Only half paying attention, I replied that I wanted to be a pro as well. And suddenly, Katsuki was 300% alert, jerking upright and elbowing me sharply so I'd turn to face him. "What do you mean you're going to be a hero?" Frowning, I wondered if he really was all that smart if he needed me to repeat myself. "I meant exactly what I said, duh." I rolled my eyes, scooching forwards on the sofa as I turned back to the sludge villain on TV. In hindsight, it was obviously a mistake to dismiss my brother so easily. Not only did I take my eyes off him, but I undoubtedly wounded his ego by dismissing him so thoroughly. "Like hell you are," and then I went flying, an almighty shove knocking me from the sofa and onto the carpet. Before I hit the ground, I tangled a hand in the nearest thing attached to Katsu to bring him down with me, already growling with annoyance. Unfortunately, that just happened to be his hair. With a snarl, we ended up fighting like wolf cubs on the carpet, rolling back and forth and knocking over the coffee table. When Katsu drew back his hand for a punch, it exploded in a shower of sparks and a cloud of thick, black smoke. The two of us were sent flying back from each other. Katsuki hit the sofa and I skidded along the carpet a good few feet. The living room filled with smoke and my eyes were tinging from the sudden flash of light from the fire. My parents' footsteps came thudding from the back of the house, where they'd been in Tucsan's study, yelling our names as they sprinted closer. Unfortunately for them, the two of us were really sad now. Katsuki, probably a bit trigger-happy now that he had his quirk, was already up and raring to go again. And there was no way he couldn't know that his sneak attack, one on my turn back, had set me off. Also, what kind of brother tries to explode their sister's face off? It was a bloody miracle I still had a face. When Katsuki raised his arm to block my punch, his skin skidded across my knuckles and my entire fist burst into flames. "Arg!" I screamed, leaping back and staring at the fire that burned for another few seconds before appearing to extinguish itself, disappearing as if it had never existed and leaving no marks on my skin. What the F dash? Kasan roared like a dragon, marching in and surveying the damage we'd dealt. The sofa was singed badly, smoking along the carpet, and there was a clear explosion blast market in the center of the room. The coffee table was knocked over and our clothes were pretty singed too. Tu-sen hurried in after Mum, running his eyes over the two of us before reaching out to physically check us over. What the hell did you two do? Katsuki was staring at me, obviously still raring for a fight, but I could also detect the worry lurking behind those scarlet eyes. Kasan was crouched in front of him, somehow simultaneously shouting at him for his part in destroying her house and asking him what happened. At that moment, Dad's hand reached for mine and as soon as we made contact, my fingers caught fire again. Terrified, I leapt back with a shriek. What the hell was this? Could I not touch people? It was only then that I noticed that, despite my own lack of injury, from even the briefest contact, Dad and Katsuki had blistered from where I touched them. I failed to stifle my whimper, cradling my hands to my sisti. Oh, Kagami, Masaru whispered, taking in how I stared at my hands like they weren't even mine. Come on, let's go to the doctor's. Skin sparked is what they called it. Whilst Katsuki's quirk, explosion, combined our parents' quirks in his hands, allowing him to sweat nitroglycerin which he could ignite at will, I inherited both in a much less manageable way. Like Mum, I secreted the main effect of my quirk over my entire body. The rest was all Dad. Bakugou's quirk, oxidizing sweat, allowed his hands to catch fire when subjected to enough friction. Skin sparked multiplied this effect all over my body. It meant that, whilst I could touch my own skin, once other people's came into contact with me, a kinetic reaction occurred and that area burst into flames. Mercifully, inanimate objects, like my clothes or the frickin' floor, did not contain enough passive kinetic energy to spark a reaction, even if they were rubbed with static. Which was weird, but I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. The flames seemed to have no negative effect on me and, as proved by Katsuki's explosion, I had a slight tolerance to other forms/sources of fire. Basically, I could get physically hit but I couldn't actually burn. Singed, yes. Burned, no. Something to do with my own explosive secretion having a canceling effect on my skin. Of course, all this medical and scientific jargon was said for my parents. All they aimed at me was, your skin catches fire when touched. Be careful, okay? As for my twin, his own quirk was still activating randomly. I wondered if that was a simple lack of control or if he was just that angry, and the doctor had ended up handing him 2 large pieces of ice to hold, one in each hand, to cool down his sweat glands and temporarily stop his quirk. Katsuki was extremely quiet beside me. Would I ever get to hold his hand again, skin on skin? Needless to say, I burst into tears. It wasn't fair. I'd just been reborn, ripped from everything I'd known. Why the hell did I have to get a quirk that isolated me? Was this to be my fate, slowly becoming touch-deprived? Our parents looked pale and stressed, and as I watched, Tu-san put a comforting hand on Katsu's shoulder. Like the selfish person I apparently was, all I could think was that he wasn't able to do that to me anymore, not unless I was all covered up. Desperately, casting my mind around for any distraction, I told myself to ifing it up. Midnight had to cover her skin, right? She can turn it off though. Izuku's going to live his childhood getting beaten down for being quirkless. And think of Uraraka. She's probably miserable because of all the things she's accidentally floated off into space, dropped and then broken, and Tokoyami's got to learn to control Dark Shadow. Let's not even mention the fact that Hagakure is going to turn completely invisible and then deal with the repercussions that come when no one can see you and there's no point styling your hair in the mirror anymore. Phew, I could do this, I could deal. Will I get gloves? I piped up, accidentally interrupting my mum as she asked about the effects of temperature. Thankfully, this was limited unless I was set on fire, and even then, I'd just do a bad imitation of the Human Torch and live, if naked and very sore. The doctor turned to me in surprise before trying for a comforting smile. Yes, Kagami. The hospital will provide you with a pair of gloves, but, and here he turned to exchange a serious look with our parents, we would heavily suggest you invest in something much more long-term, preferably manufactured from a hero company. At the very least until we know for sure if she'll ever be able to turn it off, so to speak. As the appointment ended, all I could focus on was the fact the Katsuki hadn't said a word since our quirks emerged. Dinner was really quiet that evening. Kasen had made super spicy chicken noodles, Katsu's favorite, and I liked it too, and tried to fill the silence with meaningless chatter, scolding us when noodles flicked sauce all over our chins and grilling Tucson over some design. She talked to me about gloves as if it changed nothing, and how we'd go shopping tomorrow for a jumpsuit until I learned control. The certainty in her voice, as if there wasn't a doubt in her mind that I could get a grip on this, made me blink furiously. Wah no. The noodles are super spicy, okay? And duck my head. It made me feel so much better, grounded almost, knowing that the doctor and Kasen, at the very least, both thought I could learn to control it in time. Despite this, the room was still tense. Tucson had been shooting me guilty looks since we found out my quirk took after his the most, but I told myself I'd deal with that later. I wasn't sure about our folks, but I was waiting for the inevitable explosion. Kaga. Katsuki grunted behind me, sounding disturbingly serious for a 4-year-old, and I paused in brushing my teeth. Turning to look over my shoulder, I saw Katsuki leaning against the doorframe in his piece, his eyes sharp in his little face. Yeah. Your quirk, it's strong. He sounded reluctant and I eyed him cautiously. Where was he going with this? No one can touch you. Was that protectiveness I heard? I marveled incredulously. I resisted the urge to squint suspiciously. Surely not. I guess. But, Katsu, I won't be able to touch people. Rolling his eyes, my brother shoved past me, ignoring how his shoulders slammed into mine as he reached for his own toothbrush. Staggering slightly from the knock, I turned to gap at him over my shoulder. Did he? Don't get whiny now, Kagami. Just fing deal with it. If you're so clever, figure that sheet out. I blinked twice. That almost sounded sweet coming from Katsu. Warmth flooded my zihi and I had to press my lips together to hide my smile. That would only make Katsu defensive and he'd probably explode the sink. And then Kasen would kill us. So, I played it casual, stepping up next to him and leaning to spit out the lather in my mouth. So, I reached to cup my hands under the tap and Katsu automatically turned it on for me. Does this mean you think I can be a hero? I gulped the water in my hands, rinsing my mouth and then spitting it out. Whatever, I guess. Katsu looked away pointedly when I started grinning. We're twins, so don't show me up. No worries there, you're strong as well, Katsu. I commented airily, as if it was common knowledge as I started washing my face. That was the way to deal with Katsu. If he thought you were strong, you had to acknowledge him as equally capable. He took everything extremely personally, so you had to be careful. That was also where Izuku had always gone wrong in the anime/manga and why Kirishima was able to get so close to him. Izuku's determination to catch up with my brother, when he perceived him as weak, looked like the younger boy was dragging him down to his level, in Katsuki's eyes. And when Izuku gained one for all, it felt like he'd been secretly laughing at him for years. I told myself I'd never make that mistake, even if it was well-intentioned. The grins we shared were just a touch evil. Right, Kagami? Kasan planted her feet and held up 2 hangers for my perusal. Scuba or cyclist? Staring back with a deadpan expression, I couldn't believe this was happening. I understood what the docs meant when they said, if anything touches your skin that's not your own skin or inanimate, it will create a spark, but did I really have to dress like I was going deep-sea diving all the time? Couldn't I just hold up a sign saying, don't touch me or you will burn? Granted, it did sound just a tad crazy, but all the more personal space. Then again, at nursery and with my roughhousing brother? Cyclist, I sighed tiredly. At least then I wouldn't squeak like a tire when I fidgeted. And it would be cooler. I didn't even realize they did full-length one-piece suits, let alone one small enough for tykes like me. Then again, who knew what was needed in a society where toddlers gained ridiculous abilities? Kasan and I were in a sports shop in the Kiyoshi Ward shopping mall. Yep, that mall, and trying to think of what I'd need. We'd already spent a good few hours in a furniture store, picking out a sofa. Thinking about the smoke and soot bound to become a part of our lives. Because of Katsu more than me, we'd finally settled on a black Elcher sofa. It would be the easiest to clean, in all honesty. Kasen had taken me out of school of the day, letting Katsuki go by himself. I tried really hard not to think of all the havoc he could start without me and with his new quirk, and I mentally prepared myself for the sheet to hit the fan when I went back. Anyway, so far, we'd gotten some nice gloves and thigh-high socks. I'd immediately put both on, feeling a bit jumpy in the busy shopping center. I'd purposely worn a long-sleeved red turtleneck underneath my dark denim dungaree dress. Both of my parents had a thing with dressing us. I was pretty sure they rarely actually bought clothes, being designers and all. Now, the long socks hiding most of my legs and with my hands covered too, I felt a bit more secure. I'd completely forgotten to cover my legs, so at least that was sorted now. The guy looked stupid. It wasn't even cold, so I felt a bit silly in my conservative clothes, the milder weather meaning most people were wearing simple t-shirts. So I better get used to it though. I knew that my quirk could still develop. The first showing wasn't always the be-all and end-all. I mean, in the anime/manga, they said that Izuku struggled so much, not just because it was OFA, because he had to learn how to control OFA all at once, where most kids had their entire childhoods to grow accustomed and gain control. So, I could only pray there was a way to shut this DMN thing off. At this point, I would have preferred being quirkless. I mean, it was only day 2, and already Kasen had burned her hand twice when she tried to take mine. And now, with gloves on, it just wasn't the same. This whole stupid thing made me miserable. But Katsu had been right, last night. If I was so goddamn smart, I'd find a way to make this work. Yesterday had been awful, that moment when Tusen reached for my hand and I burned him. So, there was no way I was gonna leave it there. I'd be mad if some stupid stuff on my skin ruined all the conditioning I'd put Katsu through so he'd automatically hold my hand. I'd been working on that sheet for years. I'd been planning to make him do it thoughtlessly at you. Kasen, let's get this stuff and go home. I want to get practicing as soon as possible. I grinned up at her, tiny fists clenched in determination, and Mitsuki grinned back. Red eyes, identical to Katsu's and mine, slowly took me in, and I thought that might have been pride shining on her face. Sure thing, Kaga. That's the FE spirit. Ignoring the scandalized looks for her vulgar language, to a child, no less, she swung around, bulldozing over some shop assistants who didn't move fast enough and slamming the little blue suit onto the counter at the till. Trailing behind her, through the wake of destruction, I smiled blissfully. Kasen's so cool. When we got home, I made a beeline for the downstairs toilet, running in and locking the door behind me. I quickly stripped off my clothes, yanking my turtleneck impatiently over my head, ruining my hair, but, for once, I didn't care, and pulling the suit on. Jerking my feet through the stretchy legs, I had to sit down so my toes wouldn't get caught in the clingy material, before standing up and jerking the zipper, running from navel to throat, closed. Tugging the sleeves down to my wrists, I unlocked the door and made my way to the mirror in the hall. Staring at the way the thin Lyra clung to my tiny figure like a second skin, from jaw to wrist to ankle, my first thought was that I was going to have the most ridiculous tan lines. I'd look like a Barbie doll that someone had sucked heads with. Tanned head and ghostly body. Gah. Well, brat, don't you look like a pro? Kasen drawled behind me, and when I jerked and I met her eyes in the mirror, she gave me that little smirk, the one she gave when she wanted to smile but couldn't quite manage it. Still, it did its job, reminding me of my little vow in the mall, and I slowly smiled back. Looking past her in the mirror, I noticed Tusen had come up behind her, undoubtedly hearing us come in from his office. That heart-wrenchingly nervous, pained expression on his face, like he blamed himself for my quirk, made my throb. "Papa," I called softly, watching the surprise flicker across his face. I'd never been the most vocally affectionate person in the world. It wasn't just that I didn't like Japanese, but that I always thought that actions spoke louder than words. I'd always been hanging off Katsu like we were conjoined and not just identical, popping myself into whoever's lap, either parent or Katsu, I wasn't fussed. I came across and kissing my parents goodnight. I'd never been all that affectionate with my first parents, and now, I wasn't going to live with those regrets a second time round. But with my quirk, well, with skin-on-skin comfort out the window, please but just for now, I'd probably end up being a bit nicer. Masaru slipped past his wife, coming towards me and taking my little gloved hand without a thought. When I tugged on his fingers, he obediently kneeled down in front of me. Quick as a flash, I brushed a barely there kiss on his cheek. The skin turned red, like a very bad sunburn, and started peeling immediately, but I'd been so light that it didn't blister. With a shocked expression on his face, Papa reached up to brush his fingers against where I'd kissed his cheekbone. There, I rocked back off my tiptoes, my face firmly set in a fiercely determined expression. I promise, Papa, I'll practice every single day until I can do that without leaving a mark. Masaru's face melted into a loving expression, a gentle smile tugging at his lips and his soft brown eyes glowing with pride. Reaching forwards, he tucked me into a hug against his ear, his shirt protecting him from the skin not covered by my suit. Oh, Kagami, I'm sure you will. When Katsu came home from nursery, he took one look at my new outfit and snorted, turning away. You'd better start FNG training, Kaga. You look like a shitty lose dash. A pillow from the new sofa slammed into the back of his head. You've already got me beat there, Katsu dash. School wasn't fun before my quirk. And ever since? I'd been so effing tempted to learn English, blitz through school like some prodigy and get the F out. But Kugu, pay attention. I jerked from my thoughts, head slumped forwards on my folded arms on top of the desk, as Katsuki, predictably, exploded. IFM. No swearing, Bakugous. And I meant the O dash. Plastering an insulted expression on my face, I jerked upright to stare accusingly at the teacher. I don't effing swear. When the class broke out in snickers at my colorful declaration, the teacher, Watsifunker, slammed his chalk onto his desk. Alright, stop. I'm going to have to call you two by your first names. This is too confusing otherwise, with two of you. He turned a stubborn look on my brother and gestured for him to sit back down from where he'd leapt to his feet. Katsuki, I was speaking to your sister before, not you, but please do not swear. Then, he turned to me, looking resentful. Well, I'd probably played with him too many times at this point. Oops. Kagami-san, please pay attention in class and do not swear. Am I clear? Crystal? I drawled, head cradled in my hands and looking supremely bored already. It wasn't just the teacher that set me off though. He'd done nothing after all, except be easy pickings for when I set Katsuki up. He'd never have willingly taken part, to F with the staff. Being an identical twin was awesome. That was my main issue though. He'd done nothing. We were 6 now, starting our first year of elementary school, and the man was a FING doormat. We'd been here 2 whole weeks and they'd done nothing, turning their faces away whenever Izuku was bullied. I'd been foaming at the mouth for years now, appalled at the blatant favoritism towards the more powerful quirks and the neglect shown to those weaker. And as the only quirkless kid in our school, Izuku had been at the very bottom of the food chain since forever. What was the point in claiming that this was a liberal society, where the impossible was made possible, when people were put down for being normal? From history class, I knew that, after the first few quirks emerged, there had been a massive campaign for equal rights and no prejudice against those with special talents. Oh, how the tables turn. True, it wasn't the same as other examples of prejudice. Izuku wasn't banned from anywhere, he wasn't a second-class citizen or anything but he wasn't anything. I knew that the green-haired boy was one of the smartest in the class, but teachers never picked on him for answers and he rarely got any attention at all. Neglect was a serious thing, in its own right, people. They didn't stop the bullies or the other kids' quietly cruel words. They just let it all happen. That boy, he'll become the greatest hero of our generation, but shit, if it doesn't hurt to watch it happen. And I couldn't imagine what it must have felt like, back when we first got out quirks, to realize yours was never coming. I'd had a really hard time of it back then even with a quirk. I was still twitchy as F-, which had thankfully calmed in the past few years, but, back then, I felt the need to keep a solid 2-foot distance between myself and anyone who wasn't family. which included Inko and Izuku. And because they were precious to me, they fell under my protection as well. But I yelled, expression twisted in rage, at the two older boys in front of me. Back off, assholes. Okay, so growing up with Katsu and Kasen might have affected me slightly. The two DS, probably around 7 or so, turned in surprise, before the one on the left let out an obnoxious laugh. Bad language for a little girl. He smiled, like I was some kind of frickin' joke. Izuku, for years old and trembling as he was pressed up against the lockers behind him, gave me a look like he thought I'd lost my mind from between the two boys. The poor kid was shaking badly, an expression of raw panic on his face and tears leaking from those huge eyes of his. And you wonder how I found it impossible to turn away? Leave him alone or I'll make you. But he's just a quirkalark. Whatever sheet he was going to sprout was quickly cut off when my foot planted itself firmly in his ball, swung with all the strength I could muster. And, seeing as we Bakugous were built like steel, that was a fing lot. The boy dropped like a stone, curling up on himself and whimpering like a baby. His mate took a step back, losing all his bluster at my vicious and unhesitating takedown, and swallowing hard. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled, face pale as he bent down to drag his friend upright and away from me. I didn't even give him a second glance. He was, obviously, not going to retaliate as I stepped closer to the emerald-haired boy, leaning down and offering him a gloved hand and a warm grin. Izuku was still crying steadily but managed an extremely wet and tremulous smile. His hand shook as he took mine, but I just pulled him back to his feet, slipping my elbow through his. Casting one more look over my shoulder at the two bullying assholes behind us, I sent them a warning smile that was all teeth. Defending my friend. After that, most people knew that to provoke Izuku was asking for a painful and/or humiliating takedown from me. For the most part, I tried to keep it from the teachers. I'd need a good record to get into UA, so I either made the retaliation so strong that they didn't try it again, or I threatened them so they wouldn't dare tattle. Simple as that. When one girl pitched a fit because she had to pair up with Izuku in gym class, I had smiled at her viciously, casually plucking at my gloves, and told her that she should consider herself lucky. What would she have done if she was paired with me? Needless to say, she was very professional after that. I wasn't sure, in all honesty, if I was doing the right thing. I mean, I'd never have left Izuku to those horrible bullies, but even though I told myself that defending the innocent was heroic, wasn't threatening people a bit villainous? Or was I reading too much into it? Either way, I'd made a name for myself as someone you didn't F with, even in nursery. Granted, they were already weary of me, but still. When I'd finally gone back to school, after 2 weeks of getting used to my quirk's limits, it was to Katsu being the most popular kid in our grade, and a few above us. Tease that boy, I swear. Everyone had been delighted with his quirk, the adults constantly praising him and all the other children thinking he was the best thing since sliced bread. Katsu basked in the attention, growing more and more self-assured in his own importance, and I was getting worried. I felt like standing on a desk and screaming at everyone, "Will you please stop undoing all my hard work?" as Katsuki's ego got bigger and bigger. Until the day I decided to pop that bubble before we all suffocated. "Katsu, give it a rest," I groaned, slumped back on my hands on the grass. We were in the playground at school, it was lunchtime and I'd been back at nursery for a month now. And I wasn't sure how much more I could take. "Shut up, Kagami. You're just jealous." One of the boys sniped, eliciting a series of annoying yes from the crowd that had gathered to watch Katsu give another demonstration. "I'm not," I said shortly. "I have my own quirk, thanks, so I don't need my brother's and I don't need to see it every 5 goddamn minutes. It's you who's jealous." The same boy, some kid with dark red hair and electric blue eyes, made an angrily affronted noise before turning to my twin. "Tell her, Katsuki," he pointed angrily back at me. "Tell Kagami she's jealous." Katsu, who's been ignoring the exchange until now, jerked around and glared angrily at us both, evidently annoyed he'd been dragged into something so trivial. Idiot." He dismissed the boy, who gaped in disbelief, before turning to me. "Kagami knows my quirk is the best, but hers is strong enough." "Oh, that is fing it." My eyes flashed with fire and, against my better judgment, I found myself baited perfectly. Sitting up, I rubbed my gloved hands together meaningfully and noted the way Katsu's eyes dropped in anticipation. Boy, was Ifang looking for a fight. Did he seriously think I'd let him win? But if I made him lose in front of all our peers, would he ever let it go? Watching as his palms crackled like sparklers, I sweat dropped at the situation. Probably not. I'm not going to fight you, Katsu. I narrowed my eyes, staring into his identical ones. We're equals, and I think all our fights have proven that. You may have more control, Katsu, but I don't. Burn. Katsuki snarled down at me for a moment, and I honestly thought he might attack me anyway. But then, like a genuine Ifang miracle, my twin slowly calmed down and his palms stopped sparking. Scarlet bore into scarlet for a long moment. Fine, Kaga. He grumbled, jaw set, and I watched the expressions of disbelief filter through the pack of kids watching. But only you. After Katsuki publicly vouched for my strength, everyone was a bit more careful around me. It certainly didn't help that we'd all been warned to avoid skin-on-skin contact because of my quirk. What? So Katsuki accidentally explodes a ton of pencils, desks and toys, and that's okay. But, honest to God, I understood the concern. I mean, I was burning things left, right and center when I was practicing, and it was hard. By the time Izuku was confirmed quirkless, I'd only just managed to sunburn, not real sunburn, obviously, but close enough, Papa's cheek. I'd cried all night when I realized it hadn't peeled or blistered, tucked into my dad's lap as he beamed in pride. Papa's face was starting to look a bit discolored, like a bizarre tan, when, every month or so, I'd test my control with a barely there kiss on his cheek. I usually practiced on Kasen's hands because her quirk would deal with any scars. We'd been training furiously every single day for months at that point, and I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else was having this much trouble. Were quirks meant to be this hard to deal with? I comforted myself that Hagakure couldn't style her hair anymore and that Dark Shadow was probably being a little mischief maker come Tokoyami's bedtime. Regardless, I had improved, slow as the progress may have been. I'd probably always have to wear the suit and gloves as it took so much concentration to tone it down that I couldn't hold it for very long. Papa had started theorizing like crazy once we had begun exploring, and we'd noticed that it was extremely similar to his own, even more so than we'd previously thought. Dad could make his hands catch fire with enough friction, yeah. But the real issue? It always caught on something. Whether that was papers at his desk or, on one memorable occasion, his shirt sleeve, the fire could spread. But for some reason mine couldn't. Now, this could have been written off as a difference in our quirks, except, as desperate as I was to stop my quirk, I also needed to expand it. How the hell was I gonna fight those UA entrance exam robots, let alone be a hero, if I couldn't affect inanimate things too? I didn't care how early I was, I needed all the time I could get. But, first off, I need control. I was becoming a bit restless, like when you really need a hug but have no one to turn to. Without being able to touch people, I felt so disconnected. I'd received more head pats than ever, in either lives, and Kain liked to play with my hair was a way to bond, but it was different. Even hugs with clothing barriers weren't right. There was something mystical about human contact. Not only was it so much more personal, but it was an animal instinct thing. Like cats purring together or birds preening each other's feathers, humans needed human contact to maintain bonds and feel connected. You can imagine how Ifang sobbed when, at 6, we realized that, because of the hardened skin from his quirk, I could control myself enough to actually hold Katsu's hands without hurting him. He'd go red like he was scalded, but, after the first time when I'd cried in sheer relief before it turned into guilt when I saw what I'd done, he stubbornly insisted I do what I effing had to. Katsu could be so cute in his own way. He'd seen what the separation was doing to me and then, when we found a kind of solution, belligerently declared that he wasn't a wimp and he could deal with some stupid burns. I'd crawled into his bed that night, covered up completely and placing my pillow between our heads. But my hands were bare and I held his tightly all night, our legs tangled together. Katsu didn't even try to pull away or complain, scooting across the mattress to make room with a very sharp look on his face. He didn't even do anything other than roll his eyes, when he woke up to cherry-red palms and a blister on his nose. I'd actually forgotten to factor in that he was a very active sleeper and his nose had met mine at some point in the night. Cousin had smirked gleefully at us when we came downstairs, cackling and riling up an angry flustered Katsu as she pet my hair and Papa dabbed burn cream on my brother's nose. It was very domestic. Back then, after that massive relief, I'd felt like a weight had fallen off my shoulders. I was still desperate to get some control, feel like I'd taken charge instead of ruled by my quirk, but the frantic feeling in my city had abated. I still missed hugging my parents and the casual, thoughtless touches with anyone and everyone that we all took for granted. But now that I could touch Katsuki, or at least hold his hands, I didn't feel as disconnected anymore. It was like everything was real, like being grounded and I had a connection again. It sounded silly, perhaps, but I felt more awake, like I wasn't dreaming anymore or that I wasn't a ghost, drifting through but unable to touch. Maybe it was unhealthy to be so dependent, considering how close we'd always been, but we were even closer now. Katsuki seemed to understand that I needed him and I think it made him feel better. If I wasn't going to concede that he was better, equal, always equal, never less, then at least he knew that I needed him. That was one of the issues Katsuki had always had. Being needed. It was like, along with being the best, he always needed to be important. He'd get angry if he was left out of a game, always having to be involved somehow, leader was always best, and I knew that it was unhealthy, on some level. But I'd long ago understood that this was just who Katsuki was, how his brain worked and how he perceived the world. Just because it was different, didn't mean it was wrong. Thinking about this always made me think of that thing with color. You know, what if the color blue you see is actually someone else's red but, because they've been labeled the same thing by society, we think they match? How did we know how other people felt? Sure, we could describe it but that's not the same as actually seeing it through their eyes and understanding. But, enough with the philosophical existential whatever brain sheet. I'd been practicing. Every day. It was mainly with my parents, Ka-san because she was awesome and she wouldn't scar, and Papa because he kind of knew what I was going through and he was my dad, of course he wanted to help. Also, I could tell the silly man still felt guilty, which was ridiculous. He hadn't exactly done this to me, let alone on purpose. Although, part of it I was sure was because he'd always given me the vibe that he'd wished his quirk was stronger, so that he could have become a hero. And he'd seen my quirk as that strengthening of his and, seeing me struggle and suffer, felt terrible. What a silly, adorable man. When I hit 9, I started trying to do something with my quirk, other than contain it. So, under my father's very, very careful supervision, I tried getting it to spread. Over the years, as I practiced trying to smother the effect of my quirk, I'd had to get used to both weakening and strengthening it. Whilst, in the past 5 years, I'd gotten my touches down to angry, red scoldings instead of actual flames, it was so much easier, scarily so, to magnify. The first time I'd concentrated, so hard I thought I was gonna pop a vessel, on increasing the strength of my quirk, I'd burst into flames whenever I moved the slightest bit. So, stood as I was with my hands clenched so hard to my TC that they were shaking, I burned through my underarms and front of my top like a match on gasoline. In hindsight, it had been hilarious the way Papa had thrown his cardigan, ignoring the fact it was expensive and his own design, at me like it was on fire. At the time, I'd been blushing so hard I thought my face would burst into flames instead. So, after that little incident, I'd focused on my hands instead of just my whole body. Imitating my dad, I spent hours scrubbing my hands together, sometimes with something between them, like paper, and sometimes just skin on skin, and trying to get so much of a spark. I was getting really set off at this point, especially when Katsuki seemed to just instinctively get his quirk. What was the sheet? Punishment for not dying properly? So, another year went past of scrubbing hands and reddened cheeks and Ka-san got it into her head that we should get some culture. Ha, what a joke. I already had a second one stuffed into the back of my head, thanks. Unfortunately, I couldn't exactly say that to her, so we got to pick something. Remembering how I'd loved to draw before, I'd taken art before Kain could even think about suggesting another language. Two's plenty, thanks. And as for an instrument? Nope. At least with art I already knew what I was doing, kinda. With an instrument, I'd always been shit with them and, yeah, I know, I should properly try to do something about that, like self-improvement, but I was honestly more concerned about getting my quirk down. Art shouldn't take up that much of my time, unlike an instrument. Katsu picked the drums. I had cackled for hours. He cited, reluctantly, after I'd annoyed him for ages, that it was loud and angry and drummers were supposedly always in really good shape. Okay, that was a lie. He told me to F off, Kagami, but I could read between the lines. It was actually really entertaining going with Katsuki to pick out his class at the school. I mean, this was the boy who could scream for a solid minute without taking a breath when he wanted the latest All Might merch. He'd recently taken to hiding it in the back of his wardrobe when I started organizing all the figurines like they were having a tea party on top of his bed multiple times a day, but didn't want our folks to buy him his own drum set. F off, old man, I don't need that sheet dash. And, when he settled down behind a kit, I stuck around, loitering in the corridor. The videos and photo were saved to a pen drive, just in case something happened to my phone. Future class you are welcome. So, on top of my struggles, Katsu had to take drum lessons, to be a fly on the wall there, whilst I had to sew a bit of drawing every day. It actually was great, reconnecting with a part of me I'd never really realized I'd missed until then. It had been healing in a way, a balm on the slowly healing wounds. Because, let's face it, I'd not come into this world without scars and tears and grief and fear. I knew I'd never step foot in a plane again. I didn't care if that meant I'd have to take 300 different boats, zigzagging between countries like a pinball if I wanted to go anywhere. I'd do it. A childhood of Katsuki being an adventurous little sheet with that stupid climbing frame and trees and hills and swings and other stuff meant that I wasn't as uncomfortable with heights as I could have been. I'd have to face it eventually if I wanted to be a pro, and because I used to love heights, that was another part of my past self I wasn't willing to sacrifice. I'd used to cry, when we were younger, on our birthday. Just little sniffles that no one could hear or notice. I knew it wasn't the right day, but to me, and especially back then, the day I was born was the day all this became real and I left everything behind. Papa was up late in his office and walked past our room in the early hours of the morning. At 7 years old, I thought I was being quiet, but either the dad senses were tingling or Two-sen heard me, because he came in and found me crying to myself in my bed, huddled under the covers. When he had to use the blanket to brush away my tears instead of his thumbs, picking me up in his arms and carrying me to the stairs so we wouldn't wake Katsu, I cried even harder. I hated this. Now, I adored Mitsuki, Masaru and Katsuki, but I'd lost an entire future. I'd only been 20 when I died and just about to graduate, my life stretching out in front of me. It wasn't fair that, in order to love these wonderful people, I'd been ripped from my old family, even if I'd not been given an option. So, I cried my little, broken heart out into Papa's arms for hours, cocooned in a blanket and tucked against his ear. And it felt like, for every piece that fell from my heart, Two-sen put it back. When he asked me what had brought this on, a few hours later and when my sobs had slowed to hiccuping tears, I told him I'd had a nightmare. One where I'd been ripped from everything I knew, made into something dangerous and unable to be close to someone. The look of horror of his face when he worked out it was about my quirk, partially, made me guilty. What if I dream for a 6-year-old to have, Kagami? I should have just stuck to monster under the bed. But then, Papa's eyes grew fiercely determined and he hugged my tiny body hard against his ear, whispering that everyone loved me anyway and it wasn't the end of the world, that we'd find a way together and shoo, precious little Spitfire, don't cry. I sniffled a bit, breathing in the comforting scent of fresh cotton and pencils. Papa was incredibly warm and I ended up drifting off as he rocked me gently, perched on the top step of the stairs. I woke up in my own bed the next morning, feeling better than I had it a long time. Last night had been closure. I mean, not completely. Emotional wounds took time more than anything, but it was a start, and a good one. I was such a daddy's girl, after that even more so. After hearing about my dreams, Papa had taken my training up to a new level. We used to spend an hour or so a day on it before. But 2 hours minimum, sometimes over 3. But I was never going to complain about that. The more I worked, the more I'd be able to control it. I didn't care if I'd be giving people red marks for the rest of my life, so long as that was all and I got to effing touch them. By the time Katsu and I had turned 12, only a few weeks into school, I was determined to celebrate reaching junior high by begging my parents to sign us up for karate. Well, I asked just for me, but when Katsuki heard I wanted to learn how to fight, well, what the F are you doing on my shitty computer, Kaga? A voice growled behind me and I didn't even bother looking up to see who it was. Pointless. But for the record? For one, who else spoke like that? And two, at this age, before Katsuki's voice drops, we sounded quite similar. Except, I was a girl. I acknowledged absent-mindedly, continuing to scroll through the website I'd found. Besides, it was ours. As in learn to fangi share, Katsu. A chin planted itself on, more like stabbed into, my shoulder, my hair creating a barrier between our faces, as Katsuki looked at what I was doing. So frickin' nosy. The F you looking at dojos for? He chuffed and I had to bite my lip. I was sat at the desk in his room, I was the one that moved out when we hit 8, so, what weird and painful angle was he bent at to put his face there? My shoulders started trembling minutely, my jaw clenched so hard from trying not to giggle it hurt. Oh my god, I wished I could turn and look, the massive dork. Unfortunately, my trembling shoulders knocked Katsu's cheek against mine and my twin jumped back as if burned. Well, actually, the hell, Kagami? I swung around in my chair, one hand slapped over my face when I saw the big blister on his cheekbone. Katsuki was fuming, hands clawed like he wanted to retaliate, except, well, I didn't burn, did I? And anyway, I couldn't take him seriously with that blister. What the F was that? Katsuki snarled, looking like he was 2 seconds away from picking me up, chair and all, and slam-dunking me across the room. Sorry. I swallowed my laughter, focusing on his earlier question so I wouldn't have to explain what had me laughing in the first place. Twirling back around to face the monitor, I gestured for my explosive brother to move closer again. Which he did. With a grumbling huff. Rolling my eyes, I showed him the Google map I was looking at. Ka-san says I can take karate classes if I find a dojo not too far away and cheap enough. There was a minute pause. You want to learn how to fight? It wasn't a question. Nodding, I turned to look at my twin over my shoulder, taking in that sharply analytical expression in his eyes. Geez, Katsuki could be intimidatingly smart when he wanted to. I figured it's all well and good having a strong quirk, but I need to know how to use it and move in a combat situation. Also, what if I have to fight somewhere really wet where I can't get a spark? Or you can't light an explosion at all as well, or I have to fight someone who's immune to my quirk. I can't be helpless. I pointed out reasonably. Scarlet eyes, still locked on mine, were fiercely considering. Whatever. Katsuki rolled his eyes, turning away to leave. And Kagami, whatever shitty place you pick, I'll go too, so I can show you how it's fangi done. Turning back to the screen and hearing Katsu stomp out, my lips twitched in a smile. Silly boy knew I had a point and didn't want me to go alone. The dojo I'd found had been a half-an-hour train journey away, but, comparing the reviews and the price, I hoped it would be worth it. I mean, not everything could be around the corner my entire life. Katsuki and I had crammed on the train, which was surprisingly busy for a Saturday morning, with our workout clothes stuffed into a bag. Over Katsu's shoulder. Trains always made me a bit nervous. I mean, they could get so full and I was still pretty short. For most adults I was shoulder/arm height, so the possibility of being hit in the face and catching someone on fire in a cramped compartment that travels with speed, no, I wasn't doing great, thanks. Thankfully, Katsuki could be nice when he wanted to and always bracketed me, standing to face me with his arms up on either side of my head to hold onto the overhead straps. That way, I had a kind of cage around my face, the only part of me uncovered. I was not going to do a Kakashi or wear a ski mask. The only person who'd be catching fire would be my brother, if he was seriously jarred. I could live with setting him on fire, I supposed. Arms protectively shielding me on either side of my head, I beamed sweetly up at my brother. What? he growled, eyes narrowed but mouth pulled into something that looked, suspiciously, like a pout. Thanks for this, Katsu. Shut up, Kaga. Jaw flexing angrily, eyes blanking in rage, I didn't fail to notice the embarrassed blush on his cheeks. What it's Undra. A woman over Katsu's shoulder gave us an extremely concerned look. Come to think of it, even though we were identical, it probably looked like I was being hounded, hee. But I didn't even bat an eyelash. That's the sheet Katsuki had to deal with, looking like a delinquent. I mean, I'd made a real effort to change that a bit. Okay, I just yelled and harassed him over his stupid trousers falling down. I always thought trousers like that looked like they'd sheet themselves, like wet nappies on babies. But the silly boy had started snarling like a demon, palms exploding as he tackled me to the floor. Kasan had not been impressed when she saw the scorch marks on Katsu's floor. Well, at least my room was still in perfect shape. The train pulled into the next stop and we got off, Katsuki glaring at the crowd around us and grumbling as I checked the map on my phone. It says it should be just a few blocks this way, Katsuki? I pointed and, ignoring how he'd gone into full tsundere mode, I snatched up his hand, pulling him after me. Unfortunately, like maps always do, it took us a few more tries to find the stupid place and by then, Katsuki was snarling. He'd grabbed my phone off me at some point, insisting that I was taking the FAS and proceeding to take the lead. Still had to turn around another time, though. The dojo was a large building, probably an office block which had been turned into a communal sports hall. It was large, built with big windows everywhere, and when we climbed the steps and walked through the doors, I saw a sheet ton of posters and classes posted everywhere. They probably shared the facility with loads of other clubs. Taking charge so that Katsuki wouldn't scar the poor woman when he opened his mouth, I beamed and bounced forward to greet the receptionist. Good morning. We're hoping to sign up for the karate class, the one due to start in half an hour. The woman, in her late 30s with a cute red plate, smiled happily and told me it wasn't a problem, turning to click away at her computer. I faithfully ignored how Katsu slumped against the wall with an impatient sigh. When I'd slowly filled out the forms for our membership, which we could finish after the class if we wanted to go through with it, the first being a fruit taster session, the woman showed us where the locker rooms were before returning to her desk. I waved Katsu off towards the male door, ignoring his parting jibe that I'd better not take ages. The changing room was a simple thing, 2 benches running across in front of 2 walls of blue lockers with the back of the room tiled into a wet room, shower heads separated by curtains. There were a few girls in there already, getting changed. 2 were around my age and the oldest, looking like she'd just come from the shower, was probably around 22. They all looked up I came in and we exchanged polite smiles, but none of us made a move to start a conversation. Knowing full well what I was getting myself into, I had packed a green long-sleeve top and some gray workout shorts. I mean, I was already wearing the usual navy bodysuit, so I pulled on my socks. They had special grips on the bottom so I wouldn't slide all over the place. I couldn't go barefoot and still kick people like you were meant to, and exchanged my normal gray gloves. I was not going to wear black, I wasn't doing this for fashion. For ones that extended halfway up my forearm. Less chance of falling off and all that shit. Moving over to the mirror, I considered my hair. I'd always had long hair, in both lives, if you ignored one terrible mistake before, when I'd foolishly gotten a bob and regretted it for years, and I love it but this hair wasn't really the most manageable. Katsuki and I had the same hair after all. Ergo, spiky blonde explosion. And I wasn't best jeanist, I couldn't just slick it back like I was a Pantene ad. My hair was quite long, brushing the middle of my back, and was sharply jagged, sticking up everywhere. Before, I'd always groaned about how my super straight hair never did anything, just falling straight down my spine to my thighs. Now, I just wanted my hair to FNG chill. You know, Katsuki and I looked a lot like our Kasan and she rocked a bob like a boss. Maybe I should get one. I mean, I'd seen an ad promoting the salon upstairs. Putting those thoughts aside for now, I pulled my ridiculous mane into a tight ballerina bun. If we were sparring, Katsuki would insist we fight and a ponytail would be like waving a red flag at a bull. Dee would definitely drag me around by my hair. Bang! All of us girls leapt a foot in the air when something slammed into the door. Or someone. Kagami! Get your shitty butt out here, it's evening time. Chuffing a laugh under my breath, I shoved my things into a locker, locking it and slipping the key into my sports bra. I was still, tragically, pretty flat stead, but it was good support. Hey, no judging. If I wore it on my wrist, it would swing about and jingle when I moved. After all, a bra was a girl's favorite pocket. Turning my back to my locker, I took in the shocked looks on everyone's faces. Ha, wow, Katsuki, way to be charming. Sorry, I smiled cheerfully, moving towards the door. My twin doesn't like being late. The dojo was actually just a large hall, like a gymnasium, with laminated floors and a high ceiling. There were a few other people already there and the class wasn't very big at all, probably 12 of us, max. The sensei was stood off to one side and beamed at the sight of new faces. Miles sensei was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, a perpetually smiling mustache and feet that were probably triple the size of normal. His quirk? They'd be very good for keeping balance and dish out a mean kick. He greeted us cheerfully, not even bothered by my brother's antagonistic attitude. Kudos. And, even as I told him the special circumstances of my quirk, I was completely distracted the entire time he was speaking. His mustache moved so much. It was like the mustache was his mouth. I couldn't see lips or teeth or anything when he spoke, just that ridiculous mustache, bouncing away like a squirrel on his upper lip dash. Even when he grinned, the ends just curled up. What the hell? How did facial hair even get that range of, or any mobility? Fighting in pairs after we warm up. Just basic blocks. And punches, and I'll go through and correct stances dash. An elbow jabbed my ribs and, with a low oof, I turned to see Katsu glaring at me impatiently. Alright, warm up sheet. On autopilot, I went through my old stretches, ones that had been ingrained from 13 years before and I could probably never forget. I was vaguely aware that Katsuki was subtly copying my moves. I was a good 3 steps ahead of everyone else, oops, and only jerked from my thoughts when Miles sensei came over to ask if I'd done martial arts before. Oh. I grinned sheepishly. Sheet, why was I such a dork? No, I like watching fights on TV dash, not technically a lie. And I watched a few tutorials before I signed us up. The man beamed, evidently impressed with my forethought and natural understanding, and moved off to help a girl, who was shakily trying to balance on one leg and looked like a weak breeze would knock her over. Well, Katsuki huffed and I internally rolled my eyes. I knew he wouldn't let this go. There really was no rest for the wicked. I turned to throw him an unimpressed look over my shoulder before I reached down to stretch out my legs, gently rotating my ankle and lightly tapping my fingers to my toes. Fine. I tried some stuff out but knew I'd need an actually sensei to get anywhere, which is why I asked Ka-san. I admitted, resolutely getting on with my stretches. Katsuki was silent for a long moment. You started FNG training without me? For a boy who liked to deny his emotions and bonds, he sure could get huffy about being left out. Without you? I parried back, straightening and starting to rotate my shoulders. We've never trained together, Katsu. You did your thing with your quirk and I've been doing mine. A quiet teach was all the response I got. Miles sensei then had us throwing basic punches and blocks in a line, walking up and down in front of us and correcting any faults in our form. I'd been a red belt, almost a brown, when I died. Although different companies and dojos had slightly different rankings, in my dojo I had been 2 belts below black, which was pretty good considering I'd been juggling it alongside fencing and school. Katsuki also had no issues here, although he didn't have the exact defense that karate practiced, strong sweeps of arms to mercilessly knock blows away before they could land. His punches were strong and sure, perfected from our roughhousing and his scuffles with the older kids. I didn't doubt that, despite his hypocritical complaints, he'd probably been practicing some moves alongside his quirk. When sensei decided that we all knew enough basics to manage a small spar, we were split into pairs and told to exchange soft blows, to get a feel for moving in the moment. Naturally, Katsuki and I paired up. And then it, obviously, went too far. Without a warning, Katsuki lunged at me, one arm already sweeping back for a powerful punch and a hard smirk twisting his lips. Eyes wide, I instinctively ducked low, slipping inside his guard and pulling my punch. The blow to the center of his iti knocked him off balance, and I took the chance to get some space between us, but Katsuki recovered quickly, eyes gleaming as he riled himself up for a fight. Shitty F-. We're meant to have a nice and gentle spar. Spar, Katsu? I reminded him, narrowed red meeting narrowed red. Blowing my warning off, Katsuki lunged forward a second time, but when I made to block again, he lifted his leg up for a kick. Spontaneous. Sweeping my own arm down to intercept, I ducked underneath the next punch, feeling it pass over my head. If it had hit, we'd have had a fire on our hands. Thinking fast, I jabbed 2 quick punches into his exposed ribs, not even blinking when Katsuki let out a low grunt at the force. Then, before he could bring his arms around again, I swung my arm around his neck, looping 1 foot around his ankle and pulled. Katsu went down on his face and I just managed to catch myself before I fell on top of him. Boy was heavy. Wonderful, Kagami-san. Miles-sensei's voice pulled me back to the room and I swallowed when I saw that everyone was staring at us. A strong hand clapped me on the shoulder, and when sensei started telling me I had some great instincts for close-range combat, I just nodded along. Katsuki leapt off the floor, silent and watchful, and I met his gaze squarely. He continuously surprised me, sometimes exploding and sometimes letting things go. I wasn't sure if it was just the limited view we'd been given in the manga/anime, but I thought he might have been much more considering now. He was still a massive arsehole and ridiculously hot-headed, but he genuinely cared about me. It was evident in the way he watched out for me, hoarding my attention from Izuku viciously, stupid, jealous, possessive little brother, and never showing any hesitance towards me, even with my horrible quirk. So now, I didn't know how he'd react to the knowledge that I was good at this, better than him. Again, Kagami. He snarled, ruby eyes burning with determination and unholy anticipation. He was going for the now someone can fight me, and Kagami is worthy of being my twin and equal route. We got the membership. Cousin had yelled at me for not going, letting her make a pampering day of it when we came back that evening and my long mane was gone. I honestly think she was just feeling betrayed that I'd gone with Katsu of all people and not her, which was understandable, considering we'd connected over the years through playing with my hair when we couldn't touch. She was super flattered though. I could tell from the victorious gleam in her eye that our bobs now matched, even if I'd gone for an extreme side parting and had had some beach wave spray added to it to make it a bit wavy. Of course, any kind of happiness disappeared when she saw the double piercings in both my lobes, studded with ruby red gems. And when she noticed that I, after I'd had to all but strap Katsuki to the chair after me, had made my brother get a tiny hoop in each earlobe, I think all our neighbors, even the ones at the end of the street, were now aware of how much Katsu looked like a delinquent. After seeing me experiment and improve as the years passed by, Izuku had taken a keen interest in my quirk, wanting updates on how I was doing and any new developments. I'd internally crowed in victory like the fangirl I was when I saw that, after All Might of course, I was the second entry in his quirk analysis book. Even Katsuki was just 3rd place. He really was a cutie. Kagami-chan. A quiet voice called out to me and I turned around with a wide smile, closing my locker behind me. Izuku-an. The smile dropped and I frowned in disapproval, hands finding hips as the younger boy jogged up next to me in the corridor. What have I told you I? At least drop the chan. Alright, sorry Kagami. The emerald-haired boy twiddled his fingers nervously and I simply snorted at the slip-up, looping my elbow around his and dragging the now mumbling boy down the corridor. I'd barely believed it when I'd first seen him do it, at 5 years old. Almost unable to hold in my incredulous laugh that it was actually happening, but now it was old hat. Just simply Izuku. What was that? I asked innocently, hopping down the steps towards the main doors. The corridors were almost empty by now, most kids having started heading home already, but I'd run late when I was looking for Katsu. And Izuku had found me. Can I ask you a few more questions about our quirk if that's okay, Udent the Vito dash? My laughter cut him off and I quickly grinned at him, lest he think I was being mean. I mean, we'd been friends for over 8 years now, and Izuku trusted me, But the sweet boy was very, understandably, paranoid with all the bullies etc. Time was my only way of continuing to prove to him that I was 300% in his corner. Of course. I be dash. There you are. A familiar voice snarled from the top of the stairs we'd just come down, and we turned as one to see a set-off Katsu. Another issue with making sure Izuku knew how much I valued him. Or was it that my defense against my own twin was a point in my favor? Keikaken, Wadash Izuku started, nervous but holding his ground. I was looking for you, Kaga. Katsu stomped down the stairs, cutting between the two of us in a falsely casual movement and turning to me, put his back to Izuku. That was another difficulty. Katsuki didn't bully Izuku. He pretended he didn't exist. When Izuku was identified as quirkless, Katsuki was spitting mad for days, and I knew it would eventually come to a violent head. I was right 2 days later. I was running late to lunch, having popped to the bathroom just as the bell went, and by the time I made it outside, a crowd was forming. My heart dropped to my feet when I noticed the smoke coming from the middle. Useless Dekadash. Katsuki! I roared, viciously shoving my way through the pack of brats in time to see my twin aim an explosion at Izuku's huddled form. I threw myself forward, managing to get in between the two before the blow could hit. Knuckles skid across my cheek, throwing my head to the side with a hard crack of flesh on flesh, and the kids watching gasped. Half my jaw was sparking with scarlet flames as I slowly turned back to my brother. Kag-dash, Katsuki looked absolutely shocked, red eyes blown wide in furious denial. His fist, still extended, was blistering so badly I knew he'd scar. From all the times we'd fought, roughhoused, even when we'd activated our quirks, we'd never landed a serious blow like that. Well, until now. Katsuki, I bit out, voice shaking with anger and bitter disappointment. And here I thought I'd change things? How dare you? Fire ignited in Katsu's eyes, and then he was falling back on his anger. What the F-Kagami? It's your fault I hit you, you got in the effing way. Teeth bared, I got right up in my brother's space. I could see the horrified yet absorbed looks on everyone's faces, and hearing the soft sniffles of Izuku crying behind me, I got even more riled up. Idiot! I hissed, nose almost touching his as we snarled like wolves. I meant, how dare you attack my friend? What? The other boy howled, looking completely deranged. You're still friends with that shitty, Quirkle-dash? Being quirkless doesn't mean FANG sheet, Katsuki. Do you really think this is what it means to be a hero? You're so-called winning? Villains can win too, you know, being a hero is more than that. Placing both hands on my twin Z, I shoved him away hard, spinning around to grab an odd-looking Izuku from the ground. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as I moved towards them, and I dragged Izuku out of there as fast as possible. After that, Katsuki and I hadn't spoken for a month and a half until we finally broke. Or, rather, Katsuki took one look at how miserable I was without contact and marched up to me, snarling swears under his breath as he grabbed my hands, ripped off my gloves, and laced his fingers through mine. When I'd sighed in relief, he'd head at me with a derisive glare, and bam. New argument. It had taken us 4 more arguments, and some tears. I wasn't ashamed of tactics that got results, until I got Katsuki to agree to leave Izuku alone. Izuku had been ridiculously motivated by what had happened, thanking me for my support and friendship profusely in that adorable rambling way of his, whilst explaining that he needed to prove himself to my brother. These two, I swear. Katsuki ignored Izuku like he was a chair from that moment on. Well, if you discounted the times he purposefully got between us, cut us off, or attempted to physically nab me for group assignments and pairings even if we'd already agreed. Unfortunately, that didn't stop Izuku from trying. Hey, Kaken-dash, came the younger boy's voice over my brother's shoulder. Despite a small, irritated twitch, Katsu showed no sign he'd heard him as he continued to rail at me for not waiting. It was his fault for taking so long in the boys' showers after gym that I'd thought he'd left. Just saying. Izuku-kun, I'd love to talk to you about my quirk. I cut across my twin, maliciously enjoying how his eyebrows started twitching. Let's go to my place, yeah? Kasen would love to see you again. spinning around to loop my arms between theirs and locking my elbows till they couldn't escape, Izuku in embarrassment and Katsuki when he exploded. I frog marched us out of the door and into the late afternoon sun. As we walked home, I couldn't help but notice how we'd all grown. To my everlasting aggravation, and despite being identical, even though I knew it didn't always work that way, Katsuki was a good 3 inches taller than me. At 5 foot even, I was howling in indignation in my soul. I used to be 5'11" dash. Even Izuku was taller. Okay, just over an inch wasn't much but still, and yeah, I knew I could still grow. We were only 12, for crying out loud, but it was the principle of the thing. Izuku was such a cutie, like another little brother. Ha. Take that, 3 minutes in second place Katsu. And it wasn't fair, I was the oldest. The walk was tense, filled with me trying to coax Izuku to speak in full sentences about his day whilst Katsuki, still firmly trapped in the hook of my other arm, glowered in the background. Izuku only really got this terrified when he was uncomfortable with the situation or had to speak to people who made him nervous. Katsuki fell into both categories, despite the younger boy's determination that my brother was amazing. Like, yes, I agree, but the two of you need a ton of space. I talked myself hoarse at a stoic Katsu, trying to get him to look at Izuku differently. And, after ages of listening to my 12-point plan on how to reconcile, Katsu had calmly told me that Izuku was a shitty waste of space and he'd leave him alone if I wanted FANG pets so bad, but that was the most he'd do. I hadn't been pleased. After that fight, Ka-san made the least spicy food she could for 2 whole weeks whilst we were grounded. I wasn't allowed to watch my hero fight recordings the entire time. I wasn't Izuku or Katsuki, a fanboy/girl, but those fights were better than any film I'd even seen. When we finally got back to our place, Ka-san and Papa were more than happy to Izuku again and welcomed the green-haired boy in with open arms, much to Katsu's aggravation. When Izuku joined Tusan and I for my Quirk training, I chuffed a laugh when I caught sight of his Quirk journal, open on my page and pen poised. Alright, Kagami, I want you to try and light the candle, okay? This had been our most recent project, lighting things that were flammable. I'd suggested that I try to spark some oil, but my folks had given me a look. They knew that, 1, it was so much more dangerous that way, 2, it was dangerous, and 3, that I'd started liking the tingling of my fingertips. When I first learned how to set my own skin alight. When I'd burned through my top, I'd felt like I was tingling. Fire never hurt me or made me feel like I was burning or anything. It was like the most deliciously satisfying tingles and a warmth, like dipping into a perfect bath. So yeah, I had to light a candle. Izuku and Papa were chatting in front of me, watching from the other side of the table, so, if anything happened and a fire started, they'd be able to jump clear. The two got on rather well. Izuku called our folks auntie/uncle, and, despite his issues with her son, Katsu either never bothered to break the habit or didn't have the heart to stop calling Inko the same. Obviously, I was more than happy to call that darling woman Auntie any day of the week, and we're chatting about hero costumes. Ignoring the two, and trying not to think of the fact I'd been doing this for weeks, I tried again. I'd been getting pretty good at it, getting the wick to smoke and turn black. But that was it. No fire. I mean, considering how hard I'd had to work the past 8 years, this was brilliant progress, and I'd never stop thanking whatever God had taken that tiny sliver of a chance that I could control my quirk and made it reality. But I was so frustrated. So what? I could touch people now without bursting into flames but gave them red welts instead? I could make myself burn now? Except for hurting another person? How the F could I be a hero when even the slightest brush of my skin hurt people? Fingers angrily twisting around the wick, so hard it hurt, I pushed all my hurt and frustration and determination into my fingers. The tingles increased, skin popping like pins and needles, and then my fingers turned red, like BLD, SPSFT. A large, scarlet flame danced on the wick. The candle burned for hours. After the first spark, Papa and Izuku had gone ballistic, shouting and scurrying around. Izuku had started writing furiously, and the noise had drawn Katsu, from where he was moping in his room, and Ka-san to see what all the fuss was about. I just sat there, staring at the flickering wick, completely dumbfounded. It worked. The F is going on? Katsu grouched from the doorway before he caught sight of the fire. Pushing himself off the doorframe, my brother strode closer, hands still firmly in pockets, before he leant over the table for a closer look. It's effing red, Kagami. Narrowed ruby eyes, lit scarlet from the equally red flame, turned to bore into mine. Triumph flashed through me like a strike of lightning, and I saw fierce satisfaction reflected at me in the identical eyes of my brother. Progress was so effing sweet. By the middle of summer, I'd burned through hundreds of candles, lighting paper and rope, and was itching to try more difficult materials. Like metal. Hey, I really needed to score well in the UA entrance exam. Katsu placed first, I remembered because of his hilariously typical sports day speech, so I needed to be in the top at least. Or else, Katsuki would get equal parts insufferably smug that he was the best, and set off that I could possibly beat falling behind. Teeth, that boy could be such a SLV driver. Like now for instance. Keep up, Kagami. Katsu growled over his shoulder and I snarled back, not having enough breath to reply. Legs pumping furiously, I slowly caught up to run alongside him. His legs were longer. Finally. Now, faster dash. This is what I got for pointing out that Katsu and I didn't train together. The massive douchebag took that as a frickin' invitation to start. It didn't help that our folks thought it was great that we were training against each other. Katsu wouldn't burn as much as others if I accidentally touched him without concentration, etc., and everyone else either became homicidal or cried if left too long with my twin, and the explosive blonde was right. As much as it annoyed me, I needed to get faster. We both did, in all honesty. We'd improved by leaps and bounds in fighting. Katsuki was, slowly and surely, catching up. Whilst I was still clearly the better fighter, Katsu had a ruthlessness and drive which made him tricky, but we needed higher maneuverability. Which meant that Katsuki got to, basically, run me into the ground. Puffing and sweating my way past another street lamp, I absently wondered if this was Katsuki's revenge for being the weaker fighter between us. Obviously, it wasn't enough that he was, funny enough, the academic between us. Well, discounting English. The vaguely smug cloud that hovered over him seemed like enough confirmation. Teesh, cheeky brat. We ended up running 2 more laps of the neighborhood, 6 in total, 6. That's, like, miles, and only stopped because Katsuki didn't want to FING strain something. The idiot was bent double, covered in a light sheen of sweat, and his face and neck flushed an angry red. Okay, I couldn't really talk, considering that I was incapable of words and my legs were shaking. Katsuki had been doing this recently, we were only 12, where he'd force us to the very limit every single time we worked out. He did this for everything. Insisting on fighting, inside and out of the dojo, going on insane runs and practicing his quirk all the DMN time. If he put another scorch mark in our house, I think Ka-san was going to kill him. But I knew what was frustrating him enough to force him to push us so hard. Especially his insistent inclusion of me. A couple of months into our karate classes, I asked Izuku if he wanted to tag along. To me, it made perfect sense. The boy was bullied, so the self-defense would help, and he didn't have a quirk to fall back on. He needed to learn how to fight and defend himself. And maybe it would help with his self-confidence as well. Not to mention that, if All Might needed him to be so much stronger to accept one for all, then I had to start Izuku as early as possible. It was 3:56 a.m., but my brain always seemed to pick the most inconvenient times to kick into hyperdrive. Whether that was freaking out over a social interaction, not that I had that many to freak over, or wondering what the actual F I was doing with this life, I always found myself tossing and turning at ungodly hours. I guess I was destined to be a night owl in both lives. Then, back to the reason behind my night vigil. It was so very weird actually being in a universe I had been a fan of. Some things were the same, apparently no matter what, you could depend on Izuku being fluffy as a bunny, inside and out, and others were tolerable. I could forgive cruel words and anger when they were aimed at me, others, never. But me? It was pretty easy to brush things off, or so I told myself. There were other things I found intolerable, to say the least. I didn't really give a flying sheet about the plot too much anymore. Sure, I was pretty sure I shouldn't deviate too much, lest my knowledge become null and void, but that didn't mean I couldn't just tweak things. I flattered myself that Katsuki was less of a D for meeting me, that our parents had a better grasp on how to raise a fiery child, that Izuku had another pillar of support in his life. The butterfly effect was FING serious sheet, guys. But, well, I had so much more I needed to do. Izuku was a good friend, yes, but we only really interacted at school. It wasn't on purpose. But Katsuki would mope around in his own grouchy way, and Izuku would somehow end up feeling guilty, over what? Being friends? I'd been friendly with a handful of shop owners and their kids over the years, so it wasn't that Katsuki had some kind of toxic thing against me having friends. It was just that my only real friend was the boy he frickin' loathed with every inch of his body. Joy of joys. But Izuku had a serious storm coming, Katsuki too. And like was I being left behind? He needed to get stronger, we all did, and I wasn't 100% sure as to how I was gonna do it. This wasn't a movie or fanfic. There wouldn't be a cutscene where we all trained like crazy and suddenly op-ed. I mean, come on. Izuku gets ripped in canon by pushing refrigerators around a beach like a boss and suddenly it all amounts to nothing? That scene/episode had tripped me, in all honesty, even if it did make sense. But still, frustration. So, what could we do? Katsuki and I had already been working out for a while. And with the amount of effort I'd been packing into my after-school Quirk training and the number of explosions Katsuki set off daily, we were pretty strong on that front too. But Izuku hadn't done any of that. He didn't have a Quirk to train or a sibling to beat the shit out of him. I was still reigning queen on the dojo whilst Katsuki extracted revenge on our runs. Normally, right about now in fanfiction, May would magically pop out of the woodwork, showering gadgets and friendship upon our valiant protagonist like Cinderella's fairy godmother. Now, I'd loved that film as a kid, even cried when I got the reversible dress-up gown for Christmas, but it was never gonna win any prizes for realism. I guess Izuku was stuck with little ol' me. Izuku had scrambled to agree, although he was a bit hesitant to be in a fighting situation with my brother. But he seemed genuinely pleased that I'd thought to include him. Katsuki, well, he hadn't been impressed to say the least. What? My twin snarled, expression livid and hands half formed into claws. I asked Izuku if he wanted to join us at the dojo. I calmly replied, sipping my cup of tea and feeling a bit like a Kermit gif. We were at the breakfast table, where I was picking through a fruit salad and Katsu had just bent his spoon. Ignoring how Kasan was nagging my brother about the continued destruction of our possessions, I picked out a strawberry and bit into the sweet berry. If I didn't love fruit. No effing way is that shitty Deku. Fuff Katsu, I interrupted. You don't get to effing call him that. Papa sighed deeply and I tossed the half-eaten now half-charred strawberry back into the bowl. Katsuki was silent for all of 30 seconds, probably trying to compute that, yes, I just said that, before he snarled like a wild dog and threw himself from his chair, tossing his bowl in the sink and storming out. Katsuki, get back here. You broke another effing bowl, brat. He'd fumed for ifngy days. And it had been miserable. As much as I gave as good as I got, I hated fighting with Katsuki. And I was pretty sure he felt the same. I mean, I'd never, ever been closer to another person, in either life. Katsuki was like another limb, in all honesty. We'd been together always, I'd seen him every day since we were born and as complex and difficult as he could be, I loved him. He was my brother, my twin. This didn't mean I was blind to his faults. And I could never, ever stand for his treatment of Izuku. Whilst, in many ways, Katsuki's silent treatment of the green-haired boy was better, it was still not the truce I'd been looking for. Katsu treated Izuku like he was an annoyance, a bug that kept hovering, and I felt like pulling out my hair. What the F was wrong with those two? Did they have some kind of cosmic fate to always be extremely complicated? Why, oh why, couldn't they just look at each other and agree to disagree and just leave it? After a week or so, though, filled with pointed silences and thunderous expressions, joy, I'd finally snapped. It had been on Sunday morning and I'd been up since 7 a.m., disgustingly early by my standards. The house was still quiet, everyone else taking advantage of the weekend to sleep in, and I found myself feeling restless. Taking a shower for something to do and then pulling my bodysuit on, I'd wandered past my brother's room. It had been over a week and he was still ADN. I kicked open the door, one hand shifting my wet hair towel to cover the left half of my face, and threw myself on top on the lump on the bed. I landed with a thump, shoving the shielded half of my head into Katsu's neck and holding on for dear life. Gakdash. What the F? Katsuki struggled beneath me, snarling and raging for all he was worth, but I clung like a koala, limbs locked securely around his. What the F, Kagami? You've been a deej for over a week now and I'm done with it. A knee was jamming into my gut and I wheezed out my next breath. Not to be deterred, however, I finally wrangled my arms under his torso and proceeded to crush his ribs in the strongest hug I could manage. Brats! Kusen's voice roared from the end of the corridor, probably still in bed and deafening our father. Not on the bloody weekend. Sorry, I sang back, my voice cracking slightly as I tried to drown out Katsu's renewed swears. Really, it was just like those sibling relationship memes all over again. Oi! I barked down at my brother, accidentally parroting Mitsuki. Scarlet glared into Scarlet. Don't be even more of an a-hole and just effing hug me. Well, my tender words didn't exactly work. Oh, Katsuki hugged me alright, bear grappled me back out the frickin' door, duvet and all. Geez, what a rude little beach. I retaliated by pouring all the hot sauce in the house down the sink, and refilling them with sugar, water and red food coloring. It was not a quiet morning by anyone's standards. At least Katsuki was talking to me again, though. The morning that Izuku finally joined us in karate was appealing, fresh and bright with flawless sapphire skies and a soothing breeze. I sighed contentedly on our doorstep, straightening up from tying my laces and beamed out at the world. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping and Katsuki was swearing up a storm behind me. Izuku-an. I waved when I spotted an emerald head coming around the corner, the Midoriya's apartment only a stone's throw away. Good morning. Grinning nervously, the younger boy adjusted the backpack slung over his shoulder so that he could raise a hand in a shy, returning wave. Ohio, Kekegami. My smile softened into something more comforting, fonder, as I hopped down our steps to meet him at the gate. Ready to kick some butt? As predicted, Izuku immediately started fiddling again, his cheeks stained a deep raspberry. I'm not sure I'm much of a F fighter, not like Kachin or you, and I don't want to be burden dash. The sudden, ringing silence inside the house was the only real warning we had. A heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder and I automatically leaned into it, even as I shot a quelling glare at the idiot connected to it. Katsu. Oi, what the F are you doing here? You shitty deck dash. My elbow buried itself in between two of my twins' ribs. Idiot. Apparently, Katsuki could learn. I invited my friend, I interrupted, blinking innocently. I thought you wanted a one-on-one spar with sensei? I need a partner then, right? You can't spar with anyone but me. Katsuki stared at me like he thought I'd lost higher brain function. I squared my jaw. I've got to try eventually, Katsu. And God, if I wasn't right. I couldn't save anyone, couldn't be an effective hero if I couldn't touch people. Katsuki was great for general sparring, fighting without thought or trying to maximize my quirk in combat. With everyone else that I could learn how to fight people safely. I was 12 and had spent 8 years working on my control. With concentration, I could touch others, leaving only a red mark if I moved against their skin. But that was only with absolute focus. In a fight that I wasn't sure I wouldn't do damage. My twin squinted at me, eyes boring into mine as if he could lift answers straight from my brain. I know I always said we were identical, we weren't, I was a girl after all, but sometimes it was quite scary. Looking into eyes just like mine. I'd never looked like someone so much before and it sometimes really threw me in a loop. Even after all these years. That's a stupid FNG idea. Reaching up to grab the hand on my shoulder, I yanked it down until Katsu's arm was slung around me. That'll be on me in that case. And me too, Kaken. Izuku chimed in, hands clutching his shoulder straps. Katsu, predictably, ignored his input. My brother still didn't look impressed, possibly mentally denying that he'd ever let me take a fall by myself, but exercised rare verbal self-control as I wrapped my arm around his torso and started pulling us out the gate. "See you later, brats. And be good." Mum snickered from the doorstep, watching us go with a knowing smirk and quirking her hand in a casual wave. Well, at least someone thought it was funny. The train ride was akin to having lunch on a hill you knew was actually a sleeping dragon. I managed to hold a pretty normal conversation with Izuku the entire trip, gently teasing him about his all-might memorabilia and sneaking in a few subtle jabs on my brother's own collection. Katsuki, for his part, simply held onto the overhead bar either side of me, cordoning off access to my visible skin as was standard procedure for us, and kissing his teeth every now and then, lest we forget how angry and disapproving he was. The sleeping dragon, or ignored elephant, was the tension between us. Katsuki was said at Izuku for existing, at me for inviting him. Izuku was nervous for the class itself and by Katsuki's general presence. I was said that Katsuki was being AD and making Izuku feel CRP. And just a bit nervous. There was a ridiculously high chance Izuku was going to walk away burned. Sure, I was only shedding my gloves, so the only exposed skin would be them and my face. But still, it had taken me almost a fing decade until I could touch other people without seriously hurting them. Absently, I wondered what Izuku's hair felt like or Auntie Inko's hands. I'd only really touched Katsuki and my folks, and only my brother with any kind of confidence. That kind of isolation. It grates and grows. Katsuki had always grounded me and I loved him even more for supporting me like that, most of the time without words or anything, but it was like being in a fish tank. I wanted to explore, to touch things. The isolation hadn't made me shy from contact, aside from the paranoia of sparking a fire, but, rather, made me touch-starved. That's where I'd started thinking about Eraserhead. It wasn't just that Aizawa could erase my quirk long enough for me to glomp everyone I could get my hands on, pet animals and touch the world again. He was a fighter, teaching by day and working his patrols through the night. He stayed out of the public eye both out of practicality for the job, underground meant underground, and an innate sense of modesty. So many heroes, especially considering how glamorized the job was in this world, were only in it for the fame. Like that flaming buttwipe aka Endeavor the Dickhead. But Aizawa had proven that he did care. And his quirk only really leveled the playing field, not even working on some quirks, so that he was left to fight essentially quirkless. As far as I was concerned, he was the real hero out there. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved Toshinori and the others, but at the end of the day, they had special abilities to finish the job, they flourished in the limelight. Aizawa was separate from all of that. And I couldn't even put into words how much that spoke to me. Anyway, enough with the deeply reflective tangents. The train shuddered to a stop and Katsuki immediately started bustling me out the door. I complied with a tolerant roll of my eyes, reaching around and snagging Izuku's sleeve to cart him along with us. It was a Saturday morning, so the train was pretty busy and the flow of people on the platform threatened to split us up if I didn't keep a firm grip on both my boys. Katsuki shoved on ahead as soon as we were clear of the station, leaving Izuku and I to follow, chatting easily as we walked the last few blocks to the dojo. I waited with Izuku whilst he signed up for the free taster class, scoffing under my breath when Katsu immediately slammed through the changing room door and came out again before we'd finished. Idiot didn't even want to share a locker room. What if Inji Marty a-hole? See you in him, I smiled, slipping inside the girls' room. It was empty, the yoga class running around now having already started, and I quickly threw on my kit, tucking the top of my non-slip socks into the ankles of my jumpsuit so they wouldn't fall down mid-fight. My hair was a bit too short for a single tail nowadays, so I gathered it into two short, spiky bunches at the base of my neck. On one hand, it was scarily foreshadowing Katsuki's ridiculous hero mask, if much smaller. On the other, I looked like a Pokemon, which they still had here. It was a pretty adorable look, even if I got mild PTSD flashbacks to Nursery. Well, people thought toddlers were cute for a reason, right? I could totally rock it. Class was small today, only a couple of college guys and the three of us, not counting sensei. Izuku introduced himself to our teacher, smiling shakily when the older man cracked a joke about no quirks allowed in matches. I face-bombed, discreetly, at that point. But then we were lining up for our opening stretches and I made an effort to slow down when I noticed Izuku following my lead. He was actually pretty good, even if they were only stretches. Regardless, his balance was sound, a miracle considering Katsuki on my other side and his nerves, and he was a pretty quick study. Sure, I had to pull his thumb out from his fist, but all things considered, I was already getting a good feeling about this. It was at that point when Sensei announced the first spar. Normally, we'd stretch, spar, perform our katas. It took longer the higher up you were, considering you added more as you progressed through the belts, and then learning a new move, which would then be used in another round of spars. A cool down and that was class over. For obvious reasons, Katsuki and I were always a pair. I think Miles Sensei's brain stalled when my brother, fuming as if he hadn't thought I'd actually go through with it, requested to pair up with him. In Katsuki speak, it was a challenging demand, only just on this side of polite out of his grudging respect for the man's fighting prowess. Izuku looked pretty green. I was 3,000,000,000% sure I looked even worse. Are you not sure you're okay with this, Izuku-in? I chickened out at the last moment as we turned to face each other, getting into the basic starting position. And just as I flippin' knew it would, the majority of Izuku's fear dropped away. There's the boy picked as Toshinori's successor. I'm sure, Kagami-chan. We need to get stronger together, right? Well, shit. Now I've got to try my best. The worst thing was, if I failed, Izuku wouldn't even be mad or disappointed. He'd just stare at me with those huge, emerald eyes and chirp on about improvement and strength and how he believes in me. The looming cuteness sickened my shriveled, sarcastic heart. I'd combust like that tsundere kinda was. Those anime categories had always been headache-inducing. What if you fit into several like I did? So, I gritted my teeth and grounded myself, wiping my sweaty palms on my GI's trousers in a futile attempt to lessen my flammability. Was that even a word? Well, it was now. Ready? Miles Sensei called, bouncing with eagerness on his oversized feet and poised to go, opposite my snarling twin. Begin! Izuku and I stared at each other for a long moment before the younger boy seemed to realize I was giving him the first move. It was only fair, he was a beginner. And I was scared, no biggie. Izuku shuffled forwards, bare feet slapping on the laminated floor, and threw a loose punch towards my shoulder. I calmly sidestepped it, automatically twisting to kick at his ribs, tapping his stomach in a dummy blow before retreating. One to me, I calmly called, winking encouragingly as Izuku came towards me a second time. I was mildly impressed when he learned from last time and aimed for my other side, stepping away when I made a move to retaliate after dodging. Then again, I really shouldn't have been. Izuku was intelligent, a good thinker on his feet, and I should never underestimate him. He'd always been insanely lucky, in his own, weird way. Katsuki snarled like a spitting dragon behind me and Izuku reflexively flinched. I took advantage of the break in focus, stepping inside his guard to tap his CST in 3 quick punches. Focus, Izuku-in. I deliberately stared into his eyes, feeling strangely mentored. Ignore my brother. In a real fight, a million little things will be going on around you. You've got to be aware but never let it distract you from the fight at hand, okay? The future wielder of One for All hardened his expression, eyes locked on my own. Yes, Kagami-chan. That night, I lay curled up under the covers with a considerate frown crumpling my brow. Today had gone well. I'd not set anyone or anything on fire. Izuku would have had to hit me for that, and all my punches had been light taps on fabric. Izuku had been great, though, a strong start that I could only hope would continue. Heaven knew that boy needed encouragement and confidence. But I'd already helped with that. He wasn't as bullied by my brother, something more akin to their relationship at UA than in school in the series, and less terrified because of it. Yes, he still stuttered and was shy, paranoid about people's reactions to his quirklessness, but I had yet to see him break down in a frenzied sweat. Not since we'd hit double digits, at least. I could only hope that karate would help. Physical surety, that your own body was dependable when all else failed and that you could achieve your goals with your own bare hands, was something Izuku could definitely benefit from. Not only because it might prove helpful with his one-for-all preparation, the entrance exam and his general hero studies. Also, self-defense was always, in my book, a must-have skill. But Izuku had done remarkably well and signed up for the same classes as us. I say yes, but I really meant just me because if Katsuki was incentive, I'd quit, as we left. Katsuki, for his part, had been stone silent all the way home, guarding my exposed skin without a word or even looking at me, and immediately going upstairs when we came home. He was silent throughout dinner, half-lidded eyes shaded burgundy. I wasn't stupid enough to think he was just tired. Today had been a resounding success, better than I could have hoped for. But that didn't mean I could sleep. Psst, I hissed, poking Katsuki's shoulder. I tiptoed down the hall in my pajamas and I wanted to sleep. Katsuki ignored me. He wasn't drooling either, so I knew he wasn't just asleep. Oi! I grabbed the corner of his duvet and, deciding to be proactive, lifted the covers to creep in next to him. Budge over, you but dash. My brother's shoulders twitched. What the F are you doing, Kaga? He growled, muffled in his pillow. I didn't give a shit. I had touch issues. Clinginess was a staple. I can't sleep. Whining? Go away, dash. I lost what tiny scrap of patience I had managed to hold on to and decided to perch on the edge of the mattress before forcing myself to fit on the tiny, single bed. Out of sheer stubbornness, I managed to shove Katsu closer to the wall and just about keep myself from falling out. Ignoring my twin's spitting anger, I smiled into the pitch-black room as I nestled my forehead in between Katsu's shoulder blades. Katsu, I cooed into his tea. Looks like you're the little spoon, little brat dash. It worked like FNG charm. I smirked, as Katsuki flipped around so fast I was almost thrown off the bouncing mattress. A hard forehead bashed into mine. The F did that on purpose. Ohio, Izuku-kun. I grinned, waltzing down the corridor towards the emerald-haired boy. The crowds parted like the Red Sea. They'd learnt 2 years ago, and Midoriya glanced up in relief at my greeting. A shaky hand jerked upwards to return my wave and thin lips split into a crooked grin. Gee, good morning, Kagami-chan. The other boy shuffled the books in his arms before stuffing them into his all-might backpack and slinging it over a shoulder. Even after a month of karate lessons, Izuku was still pretty twitchy. Not that I had thought for a second that some fighting would suddenly transform him. Did you finish the homework for Danzai-sensei? Tapping a finger to my altar satchel, a wiry grin quirked my lips. Yeah? All done, I confirmed unenthusiastically. I really hate writing in Japanese. Izuku launched into a deep analysis of the worksheet as we headed in the direction of class, and I nodded along to his rambles. A small smile softened my expression. Izuku really was rather adorable. The corridors were packed with students, but I wasn't even jostled, one of the only perks being me. Vicious swearing a few meters behind us had my eyes rolling upwards for effing divine intervention, even as my arm hooked through Izuku's. Poor kid looked like he was gonna jump out of his skin. For F's sake, Katsu. If that hot-headed idiot set off an explosion in these close quarters, I'd kill him myself. Peace off, dash. Was that smoke? Katsuki. I twisted my neck, straining my jaw upwards in an attempt to see and cursing my small stature. Katsu, F off with the bullshit. I valiantly ignored the idiot behind me who oohed at the fight brewing. Well, in all honesty, it felt like all we'd done recently was fight. Magically, praise-ing hallelujah, there wasn't a reply and Izuku was lightning quick as he yanked himself, and, our elbows still locked, myself by extension, into the classroom. Sorry, sensei. The green-haired boy stuttered, scurrying the both of us to our seats at the back and ducking his head when a fuming Katsuki stomped inside a second later. Shadowed red eyes glared accusingly into mine. I snapped my teeth. Bite me, sunshine. Thankfully, for Izuku's BLD pressure and the sake of the classroom, the teacher then called the class to order. Flowing cursive was quickly scrawled across the board and a massive grin threatened to tear my face in two. Secretly listening to English music via YouTube wasn't quite the same, Ariana Grande's bunny outfit was her hero outfit now. Can you believe it? Still sings though, so kudos to her. And watching illegally downloaded films didn't change the fact I had to speak Japanese all the DMN time, let alone read and write it. We were supposed to write a short paragraph in English, our names and basic introduction stuff, just to practice the writing form and our alphabets. I was no genius in school. Sure, I was smart. With 2/3 of a degree under my belt, I would bloody well hope I was educated, but I hadn't touched maths in years before I was reborn, aside from adult NG with finances and rent, never mind the language barrier. My head was stuffed with knowledge, but that meant jack shit when I couldn't get the words out. So, naturally, I seized English classes like the godsend they were. 30 seconds later, halfway through my extremely poetic description of my bedroom, a pointed cough sounded to my left. I asked Izuku, finishing my sentence on the exact shade of my walls, a comparison between summer skies and precious gems. A glance to the side showed Izuku pointing his pen at the boy to my right who was copying my sheet. Idiot. 1. Did they really think the teacher would let that slide? And 2. Would anyone believe them that their name was secretly Kagami and their bedroom had about 8 million cushions piled on the bed? Exactly, I didn't think so, fucker. But I wasn't gonna let anyone think I'd tolerate that CRP, so, casually pulling off my glove, I hovered my index finger over my name in the middle of their paragraph. The boy, Shindu, was an idiot who'd pushed Izuku around since nursery and was notorious for cheating off the younger boy. I was, therefore, justified. Oops, I faux gasped. Looks like you spelled my name and my entire answer by mistake. My finger dropped to touch the paper. Let me, a flick and the sheet sparked a light. Fix that for you. And then, before anyone could notice or the fire spread too much, I wasn't my brother, for crying out loud, I pulled my glove back on and swiped my protected skin over the flame, extinguishing it. The sheet was ruined, a lovely hole right in the middle, and Shindu was sweating like a pig. Sensei. I moved my other hand into the air, plastering an appalled expression on my face. Shindu-san asked me to read over his work, but I didn't mean to. It was an accident. The teacher rushed over, sighing deeply at the ruined page and the scorch mark on the desk. When I had first developed my quirk, all staff had been strongly warned about the ramifications. Seems the staff had yet to forget. Well, at least it was helpful in this incident. It's fine, Kagami-san, your quirk is a difficult one, I'm sure we all understand. Shindu-san, did you have much written down? Small black eyes flickered to meet mine before the other boy shook his head. No, sensei, just my name. Handing out a new sheet and accepting my finished work, sensei soon returned to the front of the classroom and our row was plunged into silence. Was I too harsh? I'd drawn a line in the sand and that boy was a sheep, picking on Izuku in that all-encompassing passive-aggressive way, but, using my quirk that way, I felt dirty. A sharp finger poked my ribs as the bell rang and I turned to meet Burning Emerald. Calculus? Izuku smiled gently. Why, the rest of the morning passed in a bit of a blur, my minor existential crisis still at the forefront of my mind, and it wasn't until lunchtime that I was knocked out of my funk. Literally. Oi, Kaga dash. Something hard was flung at speed at the back of my skull, colliding with a painful thunk and sending my head into the lunch table. You forgot your shitty lunch, idiot. Bento box missile, heathen. When I failed to respond, simply groaning into the white surface, I could almost feel my twin's brain stutter. I knew the feeling. I was the preppy one, if you could even call me that, between the two of us. The good cop to Katsuki's bad. He was the evil twin and I was, Glinda the good? Regardless, I was FING allowed to have bad days too, okay? Oi, a heavy palm shoved my shoulder. I didn't bother reacting. I'm talking to you, Kaga. This time, fingers, rough and calloused, reached around to grab my chin and force my head up to look at him. The F is up with you? Ah, the dulcet sounds of Katsuki's confused concern. Am I a bad person, Katsu? Okay, that came out a touch more melodramatic than planned, but I decided to roll with it anyway. BL red eyes were equal parts frustrated and bewildered. And angry, but that was a given. What the F have you been drinking, idiot? My brother clicked his tongue, Looking weirdly like Papa right now. You're too FNG nice. Now, eat your stupid lunch. Evidently aware that most of the cafeteria was eavesdropping, my fellow blonde bade a hasty retreat, dropping my chin back to the table, his fingers barely even reddened from the contact, and I only just managed to avoid cracking my jaw on the edge. Wow, that had been alarmingly heartfelt for Katsu, especially considering the location. Rubbing my chin, I turned contemplative eyes back to Izuku, who was staring at me with the most heartbroken expression in the world. No, seriously. Boy should have that patented. Izuku-an? I blinked, even as I reached to pry open my lunch. It was a bit battered from the collision but basically okay, and, taking in the OCD arrangements of the chicken bites and avocado onigiri, I realized that it must have been Katsuki's turn to make lunches this morning. Do you really think you're not a good person, Kagami-chan? Izuku wondered aloud, the characteristic tremble in his voice vanishing once my brother had disappeared. I sighed deeply, carefully picking up a piece of katsu fried chicken with my chopsticks and placing it on Izuku's lid. Wordlessly, I accepted the tuna roll offered in exchange. It's not like that, I clicked my tongue in frustration. It's more about earlier. Shindu? He was a cheater and he's always been one of those FNG sheep. But does that make it okay for me to abuse my quirk like that? I don't think that makes you a bad person at all, Kagami-chan, my closest friend refuted. You were righting a wrong that sure, you could have just told the teacher, but you didn't mean anything bad by it and maybe now he'll leave you alone. That doesn't mean you're suddenly evil. And there was that spark of passion. Izuku only gained confidence. I'm sure you'll be an amazing hero, Kagami-chan. People around us, some still shooting our table looks, slowly climbed to their feet as lunchtime ended. The green-haired boy hurriedly packed up his, you guessed it, all-might bento, shoving it into his matching bag and clambering to his feet. I stayed seated for a moment longer. Izuku. Emerald eyes glanced up to meet Scarlet, my entire face softened by the small smile that quirked my lips. I'm sure you will too. We were 5 minutes late to class because Izuku burst into streaming tears. I couldn't live this way. Papa. I groaned, tucking my head against the curve of his spine as I glomped him. Make him stop. The cold weather outside, great winds that stripped the auburn trees bare and ruined umbrellas, had chased everyone inside all weekend. Normally, I was totally fine with this. I could watch films, sleep in, and generally laze about. It's not like I had many places to go anyway. Unfortunately, Katsuki had other ideas about occupying the time. With his drum kit. Dum, de thump, crash. Dad, hand lifted as he poured us tea in the kitchen, flinched as the thrashing and banging upstairs only increased in tempo. Mum was out, the only one of us willing to brave the storm, having tea at the Midoriya's. If she was here, Katsuki would probably have been yelled at to shut up already. I'd already tried, earning demon eyes for my troubles, and Papa was still trying to be the neutral peacekeeper. If I got to paint, Katsuki could play his drums. Dad had thrown me a droll look, pointing at the mess I'd made of the kitchen table, when I argued that the disturbance was a little different. Okay, so I'd commandeered the kitchen. At least I wasn't rattling bin lids like I'd taken personal offense to everyone's eardrums. I'd kept up my painting all this time, only half because of Mum's insistence we were cultured, but also because I found it very soothing. Delicate smears of pastels, thick strokes of acrylic. It was when I was painting that the world come to life to me again. It was tactile and tangible, nothing burning but vibrant beneath my hand. I usually painted landscapes, places I'd visited before but had never seen in this life. The coastline of France, the lemon groves of Sorrento, the bustling square outside the Reichstag. A Swedish university I'd never see again. But it wasn't all from old memories either. There was the park where we'd first met the Midoriyas, the view from the train we caught to the dojo. Quite a few had a blurry blonde figure to the side, the back of a little boy's head as he scarpered off. All my work was indistinct, like it had been painted through a smoky lens. But Katsuki had kept into most of them, the views not looking quite right without my brother being a part of them. I painted a lot of fire too. Red canvases with veins of gold, like streams of gems hewn from raw rock or dark shadows with a single candle wick. Those were always the easiest, impressionistic and simple snapshots of a muse that could never leave me. And, as for Katsuki's music? In standard fashion, he was progressing very well, exercising his increasing shoulder strength to play faster, harder, longer. He'd always made a point to be successful, and this was no different. Social skills aside, Katsuki and I were probably pretty cool kids to parent in that eternal, look how much better my children are than yours, competition. Not that our folks really were a part of that, working from home and everything. But parents' evening could get a bit wild, what with Katsuki, Ka-san and myself involved. It wasn't my fault most of the staff considered me just as much of a devil as my brother. They were just so easy to troll. But school was a weird place. I know I'd said it before, but I really couldn't stress this enough. Katsuki still maintained his little following of kiss-up guys, idiots who snickered at the mention of boobies, thought I was a crazy psychopath and took great pleasure in picking on Izuku when I wasn't around to terrify them off. Like in the changing rooms, etc. etc. On the other hand, I had like 0.0 friends beside Izuku. I wasn't going to count my own brother, that would be just sad. Sure, it could get lonely, but then I'd take a glance around the classroom and remember what utter buttwipes they all were. They weren't all horrible people, no. They could be friendly and laugh and smile and be nice. But there was fear in their eyes when they glanced at my gloves. And there was malice and pity when they looked Izuku. Peer pressure or no, I could never stomach the friendship of someone who could be so cruel. The melancholy cured. Except it wasn't really that easy. At the start of December, on a shopping trip with Ka-san, a pack of teenage girls walked past our table. We were on the patio outside a little bakery, drinking tea and sharing some cheesecake, when a loud burst of laughter had my eyes flicking up curiously. They were 5 of them, dressed in pastel coats with big, statement scarves, and one girl had a beret. Their arms were linked, walking in a row with shopping bags SW&G from painted fingers and their cheeks rosy. Maybe it was from the cool weather. Maybe it was because they looked so buoyantly happy. Regardless, I found it impossible to tear my eyes away until they disappeared around the street corner. I'd lived a lonesome life so far, taking what joy and comfort I could from my immediate family and Inko and Izuku. Maybe one day I could have close friends like that too. By the time spring rolled round again, after Katsu and I had celebrated our 13th birthday, I started sitting in our tiny garden, little more than a patio with a shed. The reason for this? I had a can, an old pickled bamboo tin with the paper label peeled off, that I was trying to set on fire. Candles were my friend by now, lighting most times on the first try and burning for a long while. Paper, too, was easy to ignite. Flammables. I could flick a spark across a saucer of oil, set a book on fire just by scrubbing it. But materials, ones that would burn, in extreme heat, but not ignite? They were the next step. I'd noticed that, as I attempted to increase and spread my fire, the easier it became to dull the effects of simple contact. I was sheet with science, so I couldn't really explain it. The one time I tried, Izuku had to stop me short, explaining that kinetic friction energy sparks were not a real thing. He'd got the gist, but I didn't both with the science of it anymore. What was the point? We were living in a world where people could turn into portals, have animal heads. I doubted there was a chemical formula or scientific reason for Shigaraki's disintegrating touch. This was some crazy sheet, screw logic and reason. But, anyway, maybe it was a subconscious increase in control or an innate understanding of how my body was to control my quirk. Like how babies have to learn to control their bladders. Wait. Awful example. Forget that. Regardless, I had felt the change. And I couldn't be more thankful. Geez, it had only taken me, 8 years to stop giving people burns. Wow, I hope I don't hit the god tier too soon. Pissed, that's sarcasm. I needed to stop with the FIC comparisons, honestly. This was real life, I had no room for FANG around. The tin can stared at me on the patio and I had the worst déjà vu. Except, I honestly didn't think I'd get this thing burning. It had been different with foil. The metal was paper thin and crumpled up so easy, especially sweet wrappers. Rubbing my fingers around the sides had got me nowhere, so I'd taken to scrubbing my hands together and batting at the innocent piece of tin. I'd not really made any progress on that front either. It wasn't like I could run to the library or go online to look up cheats. There were no maths or science or answers for this. It was just me and my body, being in but. What I did know, however, was how bizarre sweat-based quirks were. Katsuki sweated just as much as anyone else, and I was the same. That didn't seem to stop him from being able to produce massive explosion after explosion after explosion, all at a rate far too quick for his glands to keep up with. And as for little ol me, I could set sheet on fire with a brush of my skin. The weirdest bit? I'd never sweated enough in day-to-day life to technically allow places like my legs or arms to be a hazard. Guess what was always, unfailingly, unless I was in the snow or water dash, capable of producing a spark? Every part of my skin. Don't even ask me why. I'd given up on it a long, long time ago. Science here only got you so far. And don't try and reason with me that Aizawa had some kind of enzyme or electromagnetic gaze that logically allowed him to erase quirks. So, yeah, I didn't have anywhere to go for answers. And the can didn't even scorch. By the time summer came around again, Izuku was thrilled with the progress he'd made, getting better and better at karate. In the past year, all three of us had entered several tournaments and leveled up our belts. The first one, with just my brother and I, had been memorable, to say the very least. Each dojo had its own belting system, the order of some colors differing slightly. With every examination, you could advance up a rung, swapping out your belt for an increasingly darker, and therefore stronger, color. As for me, funny story. The tournament was being held in a high school gym a few blocks from our dojo, the inside hall filled with kids from all different classes around the city. Everyone was dressed in their GIs, belts in a rainbow of colors with a few older competitors dotted around the walls, trying to look aloof and cool. I'd scanned the crowds and been sorely disappointed that Masahiro Ojiro wasn't here. Well, it's not like this was the entire city after all. I didn't even know where he lived. There were a surprising number of even younger kids. I could tell our white belts, the beginner level, were grating on my brother. He really didn't like to be less than anyone else, the proud fool. No lie, but I was itching to advance too. Unfortunately for my bro, I'd spent many a night racking my brain for the katas from my old life. And I was pretty sure I had a few of them down pat, drilled into my brain from endless repetitions. The senseis called us to order and we all gathered around, bowing low in respect before we were asked to perform the first kata. A few kids were really clueless, but Katsuki had dragged us right to the front, out of reach of most of the flailing limbs and so that the dork could glare into the eyes of our superiors. But it went on like this for a while, more and more children falling out as they forgot the next move. When the first set finished, several of them moved to the sides. Katsuki and I stayed at the front, reciting the second, which would see us advance to the next level. And when that was finished, Katsuki bobbed in a bow and moved to join the other white belts. Only to freeze in enraged realization when I made no move to join him. I froze too. I'd forgotten to teach Katsuki. Oh, FNG sheet. You're going for a higher level, aren't you, Kaga? He hissed, eyes dancing around the room as the more advanced students spread out on the increasingly vacant floor. There weren't many of us now, only a dozen or so. We were going to be starting back up again in a moment or so. What of it? I whispered back, shaking out my arms and settling into the starting position for the third time. And no, I didn't tell anyone. Sensei is gonna kill me, so chill. Can you call bullshit on yourself? The sensei in charge, a man with deep teal skin and stripes, gills? Maybe? Along his neck, called us back to order, mainly to shut up the smaller children and the watching parents who gossiped along the back wall, and my brother was forced to stomp off to the side. He knew better than to try and cause a scene. Not only would our advancements be denied, but we'd bring shame on the dojo, gym, whatever, and run the risk of being banned. Etiquette was a huge deal here. In my defense, I'd honestly forgotten to include my brother. I'd been a bit distracted, trying to dredge up the moves from my memory, and the thought had completely bypassed me. Hell, the world didn't revolve around placating Katsuki, after all. I did feel guilty. I promised myself I'd ask Sensei to put us forward for the next available tournament after this one, and teach Katsuki as many katas as I could myself. Sorry, Katsuki. My brother was going to go FING ballistic. Sheet. The next kata was monotonous, but when I failed to pull back afterwards, I could feel my brother's stare boring into my spine. It was after the fourth set when I finally admitted that the others were only half-remembered, mingled and muddled, and there wasn't a chance I was going to risk embarrassing myself like that. I bowed low in respect before making my way to the sidelines, sitting beside my silent brother and facing the front as the fifth kata began. Katsuki didn't look at me, staring at the more advanced fighters like he was trying to memorize their movements. His fists were clenched, as if he needed to control the urge to pop an explosion. The fights progressed well, the only scare being when I was paired against a blue belt, fifth, who aimed a punch towards my head. I'd sidestepped fine, but the move had shaken me, putting me of the back foot the rest of the spar. It ended in a draw. Katsuki earned his yellow belt fine. I was handed a green. Katsuki had been both proud and incensed at my advancement, gritting his teeth in fury as I appeared to coast past him. Naturally, it had taken almost 3 months of sulking for me to work that out. Sensei had been thrilled. As soon as Katsuki had received the yellow band, he'd been gone, stomping out of the hall. Our parents, who had snarled encouragement, ka-san, throughout our spars, crowed when we won, gen, more ka-san, and applauded us, both, when we progressed, were ignored as he barged to the exit. Ka-san had rushed over after I'd gone up for my own belt, gushing about how they hadn't realized I'd be jumping so many levels and congratulating me for doing so well. Papa had followed my brother outside, but, from the lack of explosions, I didn't think it was going too badly. Well done, Brett. You've shown how brave you are, even with a difficult quirk. We're so proud of you, Kaga-chan. Arms around each other, Mom and I had gone outside to find Katsuki pacing the car park like a caged tiger, Dad standing a few feet away and trying to talk him down. He'd held his tongue long enough for us to get home. What the actual Kaga? You going behind my back like a creeping snake? This off. It was our worst fight in months, since Izuku had started the class, and the furious silences lasted until late January. Christmas had passed in a slightly stilted fashion. Never, ever say that my brother didn't know how to hold a grudge, but he'd still given me a present, a huge hydrangea bush, my favorite flowers. They looked like bubble baths, okay? And accepted mine just fine. For the record, I'd given him some cool band t-shirts that Ka-san had never let him get, on the grounds they were too stuffy, with plans to give him some awesome alteras when we were older. And cooler looking. I was totally gonna get a matching biker jacket. By the second month, he'd stopped pretending I didn't exist, looking away when I caught his eye and talking over me like I wasn't speaking. If it hadn't been so unbelievably effing rude, I would have been proud at his commitment and pettiness. As it was, my patience was gone and I started taking his toiletries out of the shopping cart, placing his hot sauce back on the shop shelf and only turning on the washing machine when I knew he was in the shower. In the dojo, I mercilessly handed him his but every spar. Not that he didn't go down fighting tooth and nail. Things got a little scrappy. If anything, my fighting back seemed to soften him towards me more. Maybe he was even more like me than I'd thought and couldn't resist the trolling after my own heart vibes that had started going down. Regardless, by February, he was only ignoring me when the mood struck. Perhaps I should have seen it coming, but when my brother started Google ING gym memberships, I was FING oblivious. I was until he grabbed my ankles under my duvet and physically dragged me from my room, ignoring how I'd started kicking and screaming as I clawed at the carpet and Ka-san yelled at us. He dragged me all the way to the bathroom we shared, our parents had their own tiny and soot, and closed the door on me, blanket and all, with nothing but a "get ready, you lazy idiot." It was stupid o'clock and Katsuki wanted to go to the gym. At this age, the cusp of PBRTY, it was a bit dangerous to work out too much. Exercise was good at all ages, but things like weightlifting and the machines? We were pretty delicate and still growing, so had to be careful. I told myself I was only going so that the overzealous idiot didn't slip a disc. I was angry that he insisted we run there, though. And when an extremely late storm hit the city. Yep, running in the snow. What an actual a-hole. I'd never been in better shape, Though, as sad as it was to say when I was only a midget 12-year-old. But it was true, casual sports in my previous life didn't really compare to the intense regime Katsuki insisted on inflicting on our poor selves. But honestly, I was 5'3", not even a teenager, and I had arms to make Michelle Obama jealous. Who said this life didn't come with perks? On the other side of the coin, whilst Katsuki was passive-aggressively punishing me for reaching a higher karate level than him, I was choking on bitterness regarding our quirks. I had lived much more of my life in a bodysuit than I had out of it. All the while, Katsuki was reveling in the thoughtless control and strength of his own power. On a happier note, Izuku had advanced to yellow only a month after my brother. Despite his seemingly nervous disposition, I knew a will of iron lurked beneath that adorable face. The discipline of the martial art, alongside my brother's indifference, helped him flourish somewhat. Another plus was the fact that there were no fights in the dojo, and I'd always made sure to intervene if it looked like those two were going to wind up as opponents. Thankfully, mercy of FNG mercies, Miles Sensei had proven to be the kind of man who understood that some people didn't get on. He never forced them to settle their differences, simply making it plain that he would not tolerate malice inside his dojo. By the following springtime, just before Katsuki and I were due to turn 14, I had advanced to a red belt, Katsu had a green, and Izuku was a solid orange. My brother had taken offense at my maintained lead, seemingly too busy trying to best me to be too upset by Izuku's improvement. Well, as far as I knew. So, on an afternoon when my brother was training his quirk at the junkyard beach, I asked Izuku to meet me at the park for a bit of extra training. We'd all been progressing great, but I wasn't stupid enough to sit on my perceived laurels. Well, I hoped I wasn't. "Hey," I called, jogging lightly as I spotted a head of emerald curls waiting beneath a tree. School was out for the day, only finishing half an hour ago, and I'd had to shake off my brother before I could come over. And grab a few things, of course. Izuku turned to greet me, only to pause at my outfit. The green-haired boy was casually dressed in his favorite red trainers with mint jogging briefs and a plain white tee. "Kagami-chan, what is that?" A hesitant finger pointed to the pale gray bodysuit, white trainers, elbow-length gloves and pollution mask that covered my lower face. I looked like a shitty cosplayer, I knew it. I look silly, don't I? I grimaced, plucking at the full-length cyclist's suit I usually wore beneath my clothes. But that IT was such a mild day, almost like summer had arrived already against my wishes. My eyes prickled a little. Maybe it was because he was such a sweetheart. Maybe it was because Izuku was such a crier himself. Either way, my friend seemed to realize how embarrassingly close I was to crying and rushed to close the few steps separating us. He frantically patted my back, which, naturally, only made me want to cry more. "You don't look stupid. You look professional, like All Might. Like a hero." My forehead collided with his shirt-protected collarbone with a dull thump. I look like an idiot. The doctor's mask combined with my natural albino-ish coloring made me look like some weird, modern Au Kakashi costume. A hesitant arm curled around my shoulders, and I froze for an instant. Izuku's t-shirt was short-sleeved, there was only one layer between us. Izuku and I hooked arms all the bloody time, most school days in fact, but I was still a little surprised. I wasn't in as many layers as normal, which had me feeling twitchy. "You look cool, Kagami-chan." Izuku pasted a smile on his face, looking a bit self-conscious. "So, don't worry, okay?" Pulling back, I sniffed a little and tried for my own smile. "Okay, let's get started then." Finding a good spot, leaving our stuff beneath a nearby tree, Izuku and I faced off. "Ready?" Behind the white of my pollution mask, an involuntary smile stretched my lips. Izuku smiled determinedly back. "Spar." And so, another routine was born. Katsuki liked to wreck shit when he trained. He'd blast old fridges, try and burn through RBB tires, and generally be a lil beach on a power high. Considering the fact I needed intense concentration, I put my foot down at joint Quirk training sessions a long time ago. Then again, the few times I'd tagged along to the beach with my bro had been hilarious. Katsuki often forgot himself and started laughing as if he was having the time of his life. To see my usually grouchy, angry twin let loose, even if it was in a slightly megalomaniac way, was quite the sight. Head thrown back in a snarl of triumph as he exploded another innocent hunk of trash, he'd abruptly break into roaring laughter. It was the most hilarious sight, and I always burst into my own uncontrollable snickers at the sight of the dork. But, anyway, I'd always lose my sheet and never get anything done. Ergo, my own training at home. Despite moving past cheek kisses, most of my practices were supervised by Papa. Sure, Kusen's quirk meant she wouldn't scar, but I'd moved past that point now. Or rather, I just needed refinement. I still left marks, but, considering everything I wanted to achieve as a hero and before I started UA, God, I hoped I could get in, I needed to make strides. Papa understood fire and control more than my mother ever really could. Dad couldn't control his quirk like an on-off SWs like I had always dreamed of. But he did know his limits, and he had never, ever burned Katsuki and I. And, ever since that day with the candle, Izuku liked to help me too. How's the visualization, Kagami-chan? The younger boy's hesitant voice broke the anticipatory silence of the kitchen. Ruby eyes, shadowed with resignation, glanced up to meet his, and I heaved a sigh. The tin can was doing nothing more than scorch slightly, faint black lines that followed the path of my fingers. At this rate, I was feeling like Aladdin in a cave of lamps looking for the genie. A rub here, a scratch there, and still... It's hard, I admitted. My eyes fell back to the tabletop, unable to look into that hopeful gaze any longer. It feels so different from lighting the candles and stuff. The fizz is missing. Before, my fingers heat up and bubble, like lava just beneath my skin. But with this? Aggravated, I batted the can away. It clattered, rolling precariously close to the table edge, only to be caught before it could fall. A book, a tattered and dog-eared sketchbook, was dropped in front of me. It was open on the third page and proudly displayed my own likeness. Rubbed-out pencil lines, showing how Izuku had altered the picture as we had grown, dented the thin page. My hair was drawn short, the outline of my ponytail still visible, and a happy smile was etched on my face. I'd seen the drawing a million times, but it still made me feel warm. Every single rendition had had that smile, beaming and confident without hesitation. I didn't know if that was truly how Izuku saw me, but that it made me want to be that girl, who seemed to inspire hope and the promise of security just by looking at her. Maybe I was just looking too much into it. It was just a sketch after all. But I knew Izuku. This kind of stuff was always truthfully and intentionally done. He truly was a sweet and honest boy. The 14-year-old in question placed the can back in front of me before tapping a finger, nails nervously bitten to the quick, to a new paragraph on the left-hand side of my diagram. I did some thinking, considering your difficulties with less flammable items. I sincerely doubt, unless you can bolster your quirk drastically, that you will be able to inflict the same degree of damage to mineral materials. Generally, they heat up to incredibly high degrees before melting, and even then, they don't burn like you'd want. Therefore, I think the most you will be able to do it weaken the material, wearing it down until its molecular structure is either easily malleable or brittle enough to break dash. Was he breathing? However, your quirk's effect is the work of an instant. It would be like expecting a cigarette lighter to work like a flamethrower or even a blacksmith's kiln. You're going to have to be extremely clever with how you use your quirk. Naturally flammable materials, like nature, synthetics, and living creatures are going to be very susceptible to your effects. Concrete and metal will resist you dash. Izuku. I leaned closer, feeling an unholy spark ignite in my eyes. Do you have an idea about how I can take on that stuff? If I had to fight, I don't know robots? The little genius in question, what a thing gem, smiled slowly, all nervousness absent. I think I might be onto something, yes? My heart broke into a thundering sprint. And? Izuku reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a swipe and typing something into the search bar. Kagami-chan. What do you know about electronics? I'd been a busy bee. You could hardly blame me for forgetting. It was a Friday night, the windows wide open and a plug-in fan working overtime to cool down our roasting house. Sure, the sun had long since set, but if it wasn't shaping up to be an unbearably hot summer. The lights were all off, so that bugs wouldn't swarm inside, and Katsuki and I were strewn over the sofa. I was on top of my quilt, unable to stand the way the Altature sofa stuck to my feverish skin. I'd changed into my 3/4 length bodysuit out of sheer desperation, with my head up on the armrest and Katsuki's hair brushing my thigh. It was summers like this when I suffered the most, my bodysuit sticky and sweaty and clingy, and God, someone save me. My twin had abandoned the couch altogether, flopped on the cooler floor with his eyes fixed to the blaring TV screen. He'd unfortunately won the thumb war this time. He'd popped an explosion just as I was going in for the kill, and, in the second I'd frozen in surprise, snagged my thumb under his. Which meant that idiot could pick the film. We were watching the All Might movie for the millionth time. Honestly, between Katsuki and Izuku, I was boxed in by the #1 heroes fandom. Couldn't they fangirl over Midnight or Ingenium, at the very least? I adored Toshinori Yagi, but, God, if the constant adoration wasn't getting a bit old. The movie dragged on, Katsuki howling and snarling at all the right parts without a f given about our sleeping parents. That wasn't as XL innuendo vomit, gross, but just how the f were they meant to sleep with my twin crowing in triumph with the volume at 70? But finally, the credits started rolling and Katsuki heaved himself up, automatically moving out a hand to help me up too. Boy probably figured I'd be so lazy as to stay put and just sleep here. I mean that he wasn't wrong. Katsuki choked after I'd allowed myself to be pulled upright. His eyes were fastened to the duvet and he quickly ran over and slammed on the lightest W. What the f dash? I followed his gaze. My brain took a second to connect neurons. Erg, I groaned, sounding like a winded bear, as my head dropped into my hands. Katsu, get Ka-san. My twin shot me are you shitting me? Look. Honestly, he looked pretty freaked out, pupils like 2 red dots in his wide eyes. Well, there goes my piece until I hit the memps. Oh, for F's sake, Katsuki. I rolled my eyes skyward for patience from above. Any kind of god had already screwed me over with the whole reincarnation bullshit, so I figured mercy was way overdue. You get good science grades. Do you honestly not get that I've just started my PRD? My brother disappeared so fast, you would have thought speed was his quirk. A snarled conversation, my brother obviously not bothering to knock as he barged into our parents' room, and then Ka-san was rushing into the living room, her silk dressing gown casually pulled over her shoulders to reveal the matching silk nightdress underneath. I couldn't wait till I was older and could wear nice things like that again. The third and final pair of scarlet eyes in the Bakugous household caught sight of the crimson smear on my pale pink duvet before flicking up to meet mine. Throw it in the wash, Kaga. You won't want a blanket tonight anyway. You want pads or dash? Katsuki disappeared and, a second later, his door slammed shut. Had that dork been blushing? Night? Ka-san and I called as one, identical smirks curling our lips. So, Mum turned back to me and started helping me strip off the sheets. You know what toiletries you want? Yeah, I shrugged. I'd had the talk for this from both my mum and at school with the nurse, not to mention my memories of before. I honestly wasn't fazed. You okay, kid? A soft finger tucked me under the chin, the red mark fading within moments. My eyes flickered up to meet my mum's. This Siki ball, I'd been living the life of luxury, not having to worry about this bullshit for over a decade. The viewers. Can we go shopping tomorrow? A wicked grin split Ka-san's face and my own answering one appeared without conscious thought. What a f&y excellent idea. The next morning, the cramps hit. It was like aching, throbbing growing pains from my belly button to my knees. Like when you destroyed yourself on leg day, like you were tiny and were shooting up half a foot in a few weeks. I could throw comparisons around all day, but, take my word for it, it's Sikidi ball. But I was a big girl, so I dragged myself out of bed, into the shower and into another fresh bodysuit. A quick face wash and I was trudging downstairs in search of food and some FING painkillers. Morning, Spitfire, Papa greeted me, eyes concerned as he rushed to pour me a glass of orange juice. My bowl of cereal, sans milk because then that sheet would just go soggy waiting for me, was already set at my usual spot, a couple of paracetamol next to it. I knocked the pills back before allowing my dad to pull me into a gentle hug. He didn't say anything, but he held me for a moment longer than usual, and I found myself reveling in the warm embrace, despite the heat of the day already. He smelled so comforting, like morning coffee and his shower gel. But, best of all, he was so much taller than me that, when he fully cradled me to his knee like I was still that sobbing 4-year-old, it was like nothing could touch me. Unfortunately, the pain in this incident was internal and Dad's hug was pressing quite uncomfortably into my tender stomach. My dad before had been completely blasé about PRDS, bras and stuff. He'd grown up surrounded by a majority of sisters and, between my own sisters and my mother, had learned to not even bat an eyelash at everything. I could tell, by the wide existential crisis of a father who's just realized that their daddy's girl daughter is growing up with fast for comfortation ready look in his eye, that Papa was only pretending to be a cool cat. It became obvious that Ka-san and I were surrounded by dorks when my twin stomped downstairs for breakfast and, in a rare show of consideration, didn't immediately start grilling me on our training plans for the day. Heck, he hadn't even mentioned the usual morning jog. Not once. And he was lucky he hadn't. I wouldn't be going on one of those insane runs unless it was my corpse being dragged along. But my twin was alarmingly sensitive the entire morning. Sure, I knew that Katsuki loved me, we were thick as thieves believe it or not, but it was always a bit of a novelty when he actually went out of his way to show it. Ka-san looked insufferable the entire time. Whoever he married in the future that I was going to cry from mirth. After breakfast, I ran upstairs to get changed, knowing that, if I made an effort with my clothes while still keeping it comfy, I'd feel less like a sick slob. A thought, a little internal laugh, had me SWNG by our shared computer in Katsuki's room when Ka-san announced that she hated her shirt and wanted to change. That gave me a few minutes to indulge in curiosity. He wouldn't have that right? I checked the search history on Google, praying that Katsuki had yet to hit that part of PBRY so that I wouldn't need to bleach my eyes, and sighed in relief when there was nothing incriminating to be found. Before promptly slapping a hand over my mouth. With my free hand I shut down the computer before booking it back to my room and bursting into uncontrollable giggles. He'd Googled whether girls would feel able to exercise on their PRDS? What? Ka-san yelled up the stairs. She must have finished changing. If you're done howling like a hyena, you ready to go? Wiping a tear from my eye, I called back that I was, grabbing my phone and skipping down the stairs. I absolutely refused to look in my brother's direction. He'd get so bitchy if I collapsed to the ground, wheezing with laughter. I mentally promised myself I'd pick that idiot up a new set of drumsticks. He was down to his last ones after snapping a pair a fortnight ago. Ka-san and I caught the train to the main shopping mall with takeaway iced tea from the cafe outside the station. Over my off-white bodysuit, bad choice on a PRD, I know, but I had to take steps in this heat. I was wearing a denim blue playsuit and flip-flops, a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on top of my head. I probably look weird, but, in a society of quirks, I figured a bodysuit wasn't a big deal. I mean, Midnight wore one, right? The train stopped pretty close to the mall itself, so we didn't even have far to walk all. A blessing considering that my mum had decided she wanted to flaunt her Quirk-maintained gorgeous legs with wedge heel sandals. I had little doubt that a woman like Mitsuki Bakugous could march to Timbuktu and back in stilettos, but I'd rather not run the risk. There was something about gloriously sunny days that had people flocking to shop. I'd always thought it weird. Surely they'd go to the park or somewhere nice and picturesque to enjoy the weather. But, somehow, the shops were always heaving. It was a bit trying, the queues stretching for days, but the two of us Bakugous women were determined to have a great day. Just the two of us, Kaga? Ka-san had smirked with a wink. Geez, but I loved my mum. Shoe shopping was the most stressful, the racks desolate after the morning crowds had combed through them. But the day wasn't without success. Mitsuki found some truly lovely summer dresses, floaty with thin straps without looking too young, whatever the issue mums seemed to find with that word. I found some cute new shorts, a new school satchel in a summer sale, and mum let me get my second lobe piercings done. Beat that, Katsuki. He was still just rocking those tiny hoops I'd convinced him to get donkeys ago. Then again, I wouldn't put it past Mum letting me get even more piercings as a show of coolness, so I wouldn't go behind her back, or whatever bullshit, for stuff like this. Absently, I wondered if she'd take her bitterness at my getting my hair chopped into a bob with Katsuki, and not her, to the grave. Knowing Mum? Probably. But it was an awesome day. We tried on stuff just because we could, and, having modeled Dad's designs ever since they'd started dating, Kasan was all for having fun with clothes. We ended the day with peach iced tea, running into the music store to grab Katsuki's drumsticks before hopping back on the train. I left them on his bed when we got back home, laden with bags and snickering. And when I went into my own room, there was a box of chocolates waiting for me on the freshly made duvet. Katsuki singed my hair when I tried to glomp him in thanks, all the while furiously growling that he had absolutely no effing clue what sheet I was sprouting on about now. Tisich Tsundra. For our 12th birthday, I had insisted we be allowed to join the dojo. And, in my own modest way, I thought that had been a FING great success. Kudos to Kagami. Extra stars for the effing foresight. However, great minds were often the consequence of good parents, and, for our 14th, our folks proved this case in point. Katsuki was more than thrilled with the punching bag Papa set up on our little patio and the limited edition Golden Age All Might figurine. He'd tucked it away on a shelf I couldn't reach, but, honestly, I was patient. I could wait. And that doll was gonna have a tea party on my brother's bed, come hell or high water. As for little Oelmi, my folks signed me up for fencing lessons. And no, I didn't get teary-eyed. But this was huge for me. Sure, before I'd been practicing karate since I was a kid and it was something I'd been good at. And I was so happy I could keep it up here, especially alongside Katsuki and Izuku. But fencing was a weapon. An art in a way that karate was a discipline. Sure, fights in real life would lack the structure and ceremony of a fencing bout, but the chance to feel the weight of a sword in my hand again, that lingering sense of helplessness, like I was stood before a great incoming tidal wave, seemed less daunting. I was more in control when there was a sword in my grasp. I'd be starting off on a foil again, not the saber I was used to, a much heavier, sharper blade. Much closer to the stereotypical image of a sword, but it didn't really matter. Sequences and formations were still etched into my memory, carved deeper and deeper from relentless practice, so I could only hope I'd be allowed to transition between blades quickly. It was an opportunity, and I was beyond delighted. Thankfully, my brother had no real interest in learning alongside me. Sure, words like sword snagged his interest, but the sheer amount of discipline and ceremony put him right off. Conceding points even if you appeared to have the advantage. Not being allowed to run around like a swashbuckling pirate, slashing everything around you. Bullet. Dodge. Katsuki with a sword? Nope, I'm out. My lessons were held in a small dance studio in the nicer part of town and held twice a week. The class was mainly filled with boys from posher middle schools, private for the most part, and were learning such an etiquette-based sport out of some form of snobbiness. I don't know why they felt like that, considering the facts the lessons weren't even that expensive. Then again, the neighborhood was on the posher side. Maybe they were just posers. I was the only girl, and it almost felt like some horrible rendition of Auron Host Club. Minus the mistaken gender identification, the romance, or anything nice like that. But I did feel like this was the part of the film when the frail girl simpered in front of some boys. Fat FING chance. The instructor, Ichiro-sensei, was a mild-mannered man, strict with a neutral visage, and helped me equip myself without an issue. I was glad that the protective gear was unisex so that I could avoid any cliché baggy, second-hand Cinderella looks trope. As I had grudgingly expected, I was handed a foil. It was the sword you stereotypically thought of regarding fencing, bendy and all the same thickness, lacking an edge. You will catch up to your teammates quickly enough, Bakugous-chan, sensei fixed me with a considering stare. Let me show you the basics before class begins. Most of the boys were around my age, perhaps a little older. They seemed nice enough, if a little full of themselves. But a few boys, one with specs and an unfriendly smirk and another with legs like a Jurassic velociraptor, were annoying me. Jiro-sensei took me to the side of the hall, alongside the wall of mirrors so that I could correct myself, and started instructing me on my forms. The basic stance, how to move into and out of a lunge and how to move around once in position. This body may have lacked the muscle memory of my the weapon feeling gawky in my gloves' hands, but it was like walking after a long time in bed. Your legs were half asleep but you could do it and you moved better and better with each moment. Generally, getting up didn't inspire the same sense of freedom and power, but I think you get my drift. Sensei was grudgingly impressed, his instructions trailing to a halt when I performed all the required forms with the slightest falter. I guess my lack of muscle memory was a help in this way. It was obvious I'd done my homework, in my previous life, but I wasn't suspiciously smooth in my execution like I'd already started fencing. Very good, Ichiro-sensei frowned. The other boys had stopped paying attention, except for a curious one or two, when it became obvious I wasn't going to make a bumbling fool of myself. Still frowning, Sensei called the class to order and started us on our warm-ups. Knowing my own fighting style and what muscles I needed to take special care of, I did deviate a little, but I didn't care. There was no way in hell I wasn't gonna stretch myself properly. 1. It was bad form. 2. My brother would still insist we train to the same intensity, regardless of my stiffness. My first trial spar was against a boy around 16, dark hair and white eyes. Like, white, no pupil. I didn't assume he was blind. And he really wasn't. Mihara Kotaro was actually a very good fencer, stiff and with perfect form. He was on the sarcastic side of life. His few comments drawled out with a mild expression, but I decided that was cool. Pot meat kettle after all. En garde, we called, standing just under 2 meters apart. Kotaro lunged first, aiming his foil towards my lower left, and I automatically curved my own blade downwards, redirecting his strike to hit nothing but air. The point was lost, so we returned to our positions. This time I went first. We tapped swords for a few moments, but nothing much came of it. The thing with fencing was, because of the strict rules of points and strikes, experience only really lent itself in speed, tactics, and thinking on your feet. Kotaro was fast, so much so I was suspicious of his eyes, but we found ourselves at an impasse. I won't lie and say I wasn't disappointed when I failed to thrash him. Sensei called the matches and we bowed low. The helmets came off. Kotaro's gray mesh was clear plastic, so my theories regarding his eyes must be on the right tangent. The older boy was sweating slightly, but I felt fine. Considering how my twin liked to physically destroy me every week, I figured it was all to do with tolerance. Good match, Miharu-san, I nodded. The other boy, a full head taller and built like a beanstalk, dipped his head in acknowledgement. Hi, Bakugous-chan. You are off to a good start. I've been coming here for almost 2 years. I shot Sensei a look. The man was smiling smugly. Doesn't Midoriya want to go to UA too? Yuri snickered from the seat in front of me, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Izuku freeze. It was the last few days before we broke up for our short summer break, and the topic of high school applications of our future plans had been Sensei's great idea to kick off the class discussion. Like a mouse trapped in the gaze of a rattlesnake, a minute tremble racked my friend's frame when the class turned, almost as one, to gawk. Their shocked faces almost instantly transformed into cruel laughter, and I was quick to shoot poisonous glares at anyone who dared catch my gaze. What? Near the front of the classroom, I could almost see my brother's shoulders twitch when he froze in disbelief. Shit. If he was going to make a scene, I hope he was aware that I was not above beating his but in the middle of the classroom. It felt like everyone was holding their breath as Katsu slowly turned around in his seat. I sneaked a quick glance at the teacher, but he was simply stood beside the board, watching things unfold. Why am I not surprised? Is that a FING joke? Katsuki bit out behind bared teeth, his eyes wide with disbelief. That's enough. My voice crackled like a WV as I half rose from my seat, hands spread flat on my desk. Izuku-kun can apply wherever he FING wants to. I cast my eyes around the classroom, daring anyone to FNG cross me. Try it, just FING. My brother almost exploded his desk as he shoved it away and stormed to the back of the class, ignoring how he was forced to weave between the crowded rows. "You piece of shit," he stabbed a finger at a gaping Izuku. "This is our origin story, the only two from this shitty school to actually make it at UA. I'm gonna be the winner, FING number 1 hero, and if you try and get in the way, you quirkless dash." Mouth half open in a snarl, IT in a breath to swear up a storm. "Izuku beat me to it. I just want T to try out, Kaken." Izuku's chair was tipped so far back he was a hair's breadth away from spilling out onto the floor. I wanted Jigo for me, no B because of YU or Kagami-chan. That was. Izuku had talked back to Katsuki in front of the whole class. He'd never. "Alright, everyone dash our waste of Fanji space," Sensei finally called out, trying to bring class back to order. But the damage was done. Izuku was shifty for the rest of the lesson and spent most of lunch in the bathroom, emerging with a washed face and a fragile kind of strength. But I was so proud of him. For so long he'd brushed off my brother's poor treatment of him. Sure, he'd not exactly told my twin where he could shove it, but for Izuku, especially considering that strange relationship he had with my brother and how he'd coped in canon, I felt like we'd come a long way. But I desperately needed to talk to my brother. The last class of the day was gym, so I didn't even get the chance to corner Katsuki before we were split into teams. We weren't on the same, typical. He'd never shown his face at lunchtime either, hadn't answered any of my calls or any of my texts. When class ended for the day, I decided to catch him coming out of the changing room. Unfortunately, because of some stupid little girls in the year below, members of the opposite CC weren't allowed to loiter outside the changing rooms, so I was forced to hold my ambush at the gates. Puffing out my cheeks, I used the hands behind my back to rock myself off the wall onto my heels and then bounce back. Rock forward, fall back, rock forward, fall back. Shit, this was boring. Where in the actual F was Katsuki? Surely he hadn't been stopped in the corridor? What had he done now? Speak of the devil. A platinum blonde head rounded the corner and I immediately jerked upright. "Hey!" I frowned, lips pursed unhappily. Katsuki didn't even glance at me or slow down. "What the F held you? I've been waiting for over half an hour." My twin shoved right past me, stride unfaltered. I whipped around to stare in disbelief at the back of his head. What in the bloody hell had set him off? "Hey! I asked you a question, UD dash." Katsuki didn't stop, like he hadn't even seen or heard me, so I kissed my teeth and chased after him. Reaching out a hand, I snagged a fistful of his blazer, yanking hard enough to JRK my younger twin to a clumsy stop. I SE in a breath, intent on demanding answers regarding his foul mood and his horrible behavior in class when, fresh smoke. Katsuki stank of it, like he'd been popping explosions only just before he'd come outside. And trust me, I knew his quirk only slightly less than he did. And vice versa. The ramifications slammed into me like a sledgehammer. Dear God, I was a blind fool. In a moment of horrible clarity, I could recall exactly what had happened after this in the original plotline. Had my presence, all my efforts, been for nothing? Not unless he'd. Katsuki, was that my voice trembling? Where's Izuku? And finally my brother responded. His head snapped to the side, one furious eye glaring at me over his shoulder. What does it effing matter? Why do you care about that piece of utter shit? White-hot anger burned through my veins and I tasted copper on my tongue. I yanked at the sleeve still in my grasp, pulling my brother around to face me. What the F did you do, Katsu? Did you hurt him? Something scarily close to betrayal flashed in eyes identical to my own. What? Why in the ever-loving F are you taking his side? Calloused hands gripped my upper arms and gave me a light shake, as if Katsuki thought he could rattle the nonsense right out of my body. Don't you see he's just a FNG rat? Your precious pet is a FNG parasite, Kagami? The calm, logical part of my brain understood. Katsuki, in that way of his, had reasoned that Izuku was riding along on my coattails, laughing at him as I unwittingly helped him look down on my brother. Izuku's declaration earlier had only confirmed his suspicions, bolstered the flames, that my friend was using me to pose a threat to the two of us. He saw my defense as a betrayal. My brother, who'd held his tongue on his hatred for years now, had finally snapped. I was just terrified to find out in what way he'd done so. I had little doubt the kind of things, similar but oh so different to the first time around, my brother had said to my closest friend. The reason he stank of smoke. I could only hope I wasn't too late. My hands came up and shoved hard on Katsuki's, forcing myself away from him and twisting out of his grip. In his eyes, he'd been protecting us. But really he'd confronted my best friend, probably threatened him to leave us alone and never show his cowardly face ever again. In canon, Katsuki had told him to jump off a roof and pray for a quirk in the next life. Surely he wouldn't, right? He wouldn't do it again. But Katsuki had always said so many things in anger. We'd snarled and spit how much we loathed each other, sometimes coming to blows, often lasting for ages. But we always said sorry. Mine drawled with eyes glued to the ceiling, Katsuki's grumbled into my shoulder when he pulled me into a hug. But it was different with a sibling you knew loved you really, that you loved just as much. If he'd done the same again, even if Izuku didn't follow that disgusting advice, I don't think I could ever bring myself to forgive him. And as someone who'd faced death only to be reborn, I would never wish it on anyone. I turned around and set off at a staggering sprint, my limbs heavy as lead with dread. Behind me, Katsuki yelled at me to come back. To anyone watching, he sounded apocalyptically angry, but as the girl who'd shared the womb with him, it was the closest my twin brother had ever sounded to outright begging. I didn't look back. I'd painted Izuku's nails last night, in yellow, blue and red. Like All Might. We'd laughed and watched movies, Auntie Inko joining in. I'd been over for tea after fencing class and ended up staying late. Katsuki hadn't been too happy, but that was him just being jealous. Inko had painted my toes a shiny lavender, my fingers a flaming orange. I'd shakingly done Izuku's. I had touched him and it barely left a mark because I was concentrating so much. Izuku had cried as he held my hand for the first time. Inko had cried as she reached to hold my other. I had cried too. Because I'd finally known the skin-on-skin contact of my pseudo-little brother and auntie. My family circle had grown again. Izuku? I slammed open the door to the school's roof, breathing heavily from sprinting up so many flights of stairs. The roof was empty, but I eyed the edge. I hated heights. With a burning passion. In this life, the highest I'd ever allowed myself to go, elevators and buildings didn't count, was on the swings as a kid. And even then, the feeling of weightlessness before gravity dragged you back down to earth, that I had broken a cold sweat, staggering away from the swing set and burrowing my face into Katsuki's neck. I told myself I needed to get over it. I hadn't gotten over it. And now, I didn't even have Katsuki here to ground me. Not that I was sure I even wanted him anyway. My knees trembled as I approached the edge and sweat started beating at my temples. It would be so easy to fall. Gravity had killed me before, the thoughtless and dependable force of physics. It had pulled a huge aircraft, filled with babes and families, lovers and fighters, myself and my best friend, into the depths of the ocean. I peeled open eyes I hadn't realized were shut. It only took a second to confirm that there was no gruesome tragedy on the tarmac below, and I immediately threw myself backwards into the security of the stairwell. Sliding down the wall, I allowed a few shaky tears to escape. The salt water was a tang on the tip of my tongue, the tears having dripped down my nose, head rested on curled-up knees, to wet my lips. I was gasping. I didn't have time to panic. An explosion sounded in the distance, and I snarled in frustration. What an absolutely appalling day dash. Katsuki had met the slime monster,